Not to worry. I have been given the pleasure, but also the sort of the green light to go ahead and start this morning's session. This is, I think, the problem of live streaming. People will be in Starbucks watching and listening in their own time. Anyhow, I'm absolutely delighted, of course, as well as presenting on behalf of our Department of Architecture and welcoming you all to the University of Hong Kong that, as ever, is nice gray, but actually it promises to be a beautiful December day. We're having today the follow-up or the second Rethinking PEI a Centenary Symposium. This event represents a unique collaboration between our architecture department and PLUS, Hong Kong's new and rapidly materializing Museum for Visual Arts and Culture, and the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. The first symposium was held at Harvard, GSD, this past October, and unfortunately I couldn't make it at that time. And it is, of course, my pleasure to conclude this ambitious and unique series of events here in Hong Kong. Both events in Cambridge and Hong Kong have been made possible by the generous C Foundation, and I would like to thank them very much also for their generosity in the financial support that they have given us. I'd like to also acknowledge the PEI family, including Sandy, who is here, and thank them very much for their unwavering encouragement of the efforts and their efforts that we have had to bring together this symposium, because across continents it's not very easy. Eric, who's sitting here, Eric Chen, Shirley Surya, that I see over there, William Sung, and M+ have, of course, done a fantastic job in working across time zones, continuously across the 2 continents, and they have helped to coordinate and co-organize both the Harvard but also the HKU events. I've been told on various occasions how Mohsen Mustafavi, the Dean of GSD, Seng Kwan, Melanie Park, and Ken Stewart had organized and done a fantastic job in October. And I would like to, of course, especially thank Cole Roscom for his energy, efforts, and rigorous direction of this project. Finally, and not least, I would like to recognize Ivan Chui here, who has done everything in his possible to actually coordinate and have everybody here for this day. These 2 symposia are inspired by the work of and professional career of I.M. Pei, who celebrated his centenary this year. It's very rare to call somebody a centenary monument, living centenary monument. I.M. Pei is amongst one of the most renowned architects all of us know, all of you know in the world, yet there has been relatively very little critical inquiry into his work. Initially in Cambridge and continuing here today and tomorrow, we have brought together a mix of distinguished scholars and designers to discuss and re-examine I.M. Pei's many contributions to architecture, urbanism, and design practices all over the world. Here in Hong Kong, Mr. Pei's work has had an obvious and significant impact, especially in the bank city, of course, 2 banks, 2 architects, and nothing else. He was born just up the Pearl River in Guangzhou. Over the course of his professional career, he returned to the region many, many times. He lectured here numerous occasions. We even have the posters upstairs in the Frampton Library. We are all familiar with the Bank of China Tower, one of the crowning jewels of Hong Kong's skyline, and the topic of Zhuan Du's paper later this morning. You may not be as familiar with the Sunning Plaza and the Sunning Court, 2 lesser-known buildings, towers designed by Pei in Causeway Bay in 1982, which were recently brought down in 2013 and were demolished. More generally, Pei has played a particularly important role in shaping architecture and urban environments throughout Asia, from his campus design for Tonghai University in Taichung, Taiwan, to the Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation Center in Singapore, and to the unbuilt plans for Kapsad Housing and the Industrial Credit Bank in Tehran. I don't know if any of you know those, but it's 3 triangles in the form of pyramids and 1 tower, to the Suzhou Museum. Each of these projects are the subjects of papers to be presented today and tomorrow, and we look forward to the new insight that they will reveal about I.M. Pei's work and his approach to architectural and urban design projects. And perhaps, just perhaps, for the next 100 years, we will have time to talk and write about his other prolific works around the world, such as the glass pyramids of the Louvre. Thank you all again, and please join me in welcoming Dorian Chung, Deputy Director and Chief Curator of M+, to the platform.
Good morning. Thank you, Nasrin, for that. I did prepare just a few simple but institutional points that I was going to make, but I think that's already been mentioned mostly by Nasreen, so I would just make it very quick and simple. First, by acknowledging really people who made it possible, starting from our own team, Eric Chan, Lead Curator of Design and Architecture, Shirley Surya, Associate Curator of Design and Architecture, and William Xiang, Curatorial Assistant, and of course colleagues at HKU, starting with Nasreen, Cole, Ivan, and the Harvard GSD colleagues. So again, I'm just here to sort of represent the institutional position, so I think I should take a minute to say, for those of you who may not know yet what M+ is, which is the new Museum of Visual Culture coming up in Hong Kong. We've been in preparation for about 6-7 years. During this time, we have been presenting a wide range of very ambitious and diverse exhibitions and public programs and learning programs as part of really forming our identity, but also building awareness amongst the public, of course, first and foremost in Hong Kong, but also internationally. At the same time, we have been building, I think we can say first of its kind of a collection in Asia, which is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. 3 disciplines, main disciplines for M+ are design and architecture, moving image, and visual art. And especially when it comes to architecture, there is no comparable institution in all of Asia, so there has been a lot of groundbreaking work that has been done by our design and architecture team. And I really think of this very also ambitious two-continent, as you put it, symposia, as one of those initiatives by the design and architecture curatorial team at M+. I guess another thing perhaps I should say, well, there are actually a couple of other things, and in case you're wondering, I'm making the point of how we are building the institution at M+ is through active public programs and collections, and of course building an international team of people. But everybody's always wondering about what about the building, and that's very much under construction. A 60,000 square meter building designed by Herzog and de Meuron. It's been under construction for almost 3 years. Now we are definitely above the ground. It's visible in the West Kowloon Culture District across Victoria Harbor. You can see it even from here. So, you know, it's going quite well there. But I guess lastly, what I would say is that one thing that we have been talking quite a lot internally is how, as not just public but also pedagogical institution, M+ also needs to form very important and lasting relationships with important educational institutions in Hong Kong. So we've been making little efforts here and there, and I really think of this symposium, Rethinking PEI, a centennial symposium, as a really important step towards what we hope will be a long-lasting relationship, not only in architecture, but many other disciplines and mediums we are covering. So thank you again for our colleagues and co-organizers here at HKU. And now I'm going to ask Cole to come up to the podium.
Thank you all for being here. It's a thrill after over a year, I think, of preparation to see everyone in the same room. And I also need to thank, of course, the head of my department, Nasreen, for all of her unflagging support. I also want to thank the other co-organizers, Eric, Shirley, and William with M+, Sang, Melanie, Moisen, and others at the GSD, and colleagues here at HKU, particularly Ivan Choi and Jenny So, who are fantastic logistical coordinators. So thanks. What I'm just going to do briefly this morning is to try and connect the conversations that we had in Cambridge earlier this year in October with the discussions that we'll be having today and tomorrow. We thought as a co-organizing committee it would be helpful to briefly summarize some of the major themes, the issues, and the topics presented there as a segue of sorts into our first panel this morning. I also should point out that Harvard actually held 2 events. There was an initial birthday celebration for Mr. PEI held in March, which was then followed by the first Rethinking symposium in October. That October event began. Let me quickly bring up my images here. That initial October event began with a roundtable discussion provocatively titled The Emergence of a Modern Practice. Grace Law, Bill Peterson, Sandy Pei, Shohei Shigematsu, and Yvonne Sito discussed the ways of working at IMPE and Partners and Pei Cobb Fried and Partners, and the extent to which issues such as the organizational structure of the firm and the delegation of projects actively shaped and influenced the firm's built work. We moved on to a first panel, which was organized around the theme of technology. It included papers by Janet Adams-Strong, who's here in the audience with us today, Annette Fierro, Brett Schneider, and Leslie Robertson, on a range of projects that collectively spoke to the important, if underappreciated, structural and material innovations and experimentations taking place in Mr. Pei's work. These included the sophisticated low-cost concrete formwork of Kips Bay, cutting-edge parabolic curvature on display in the proposed hyperbolide project, the complex space grid structure employed in the Louvre's glass pyramid, and the specific structural challenges of the Bank of China Tower here in Hong Kong. On the second panel, Michael Hayes, Danny Abramson, Stuart Leslie, Thomas Leslie, and Lai Delin each shed new light on the particular spatial and formal qualities of several selected Pei projects. These included the preliminary site analysis completed by the firm in relation to Boston's Government Center, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Mesa Library in Boulder, Colorado, the Everson Museum of Art and the Des Moines Art Center addition, as well as the Fragrant Hill Hotel and Suzhou Museum. Finally, in the third panel, which was moderated by Seng Kwan, who's also here with us for the next 2 days, the papers were organized under the themes of power, capital, and people. Each presentation explored the broader political, economic, and social aspects of several selected Pei projects. Edward Eigen discussed the JFK Presidential Library and Museum. André Bedoux reassessed Pei's unbuilt proposal for La Défense in Paris. I resituated the Fragrant Hill Hotel within the anxious inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party at the beginning of the early reform era. And Shirley Soraya, working in collaboration with Kellogg Wong, discussed Mr. Pei's urban design work in Singapore. Collectively, and over the course of two incredibly productive and fruitful 2 days, the range of themes and issues that emerged included topics such as the importance of structural and technological experimentation to Mr. Pei's practice, the legacy of the thesis, both as a method of intellectual inquiry within the discipline of architecture, but in more specific relationship to Mr. Pei's two theses, the celebrated Masters of Architecture thesis completed at the GSD, and the relatively under-examined Bachelors of Architecture thesis completed at MIT. The role of time and progression in Mr. Pei's work, Mr. Pei's uneasy relationship with academia and its effects on his critical reception, Mr. Pei's formal fascination with sculpture and its display, and more generally, the issue of professional practice. One theme that was not explicitly highlighted in the Harvard event, but which came up in the discussions and question and answer sessions several times, was this issue of identity. That is, how might Mr. Pei's American citizenship and Chinese ethnicity have shaped client relations and/or specific architectural and urban intervention strategies at various points in his career. And it's this question of identity that, in fact, was one of the original rationales for organizing the Rethinking Pei events in this way, i.e. in the United States and in Hong Kong. These two cities seem to capture the global dynamics of Mr. Pei's upbringing, his practice, and his architecture. Identity, not coincidentally, also forms the thematic basis for our first panel today, in which each of the speakers will offer thoughts on Mr. Pei's work in China, a term used to mark physical and conceptual terrain with a variety of distinctive and contested meanings today. So with that, I'll welcome to the podium my colleague, Ju Tao, who will be moderating the first panel and introducing the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ko, for making this beautiful transition to our first panel. So first, I would say that the title for our first panel is Visions of China, or Pei's Visions of China. I also want to say probably we can also call it Pei's Versions of China. So it's extremely meaningful for our first panel with four speakers originally from Taiwan mainland and the U.S. With various international background and experience together here, Hong Kong, and to discuss PEI's visions of China. So I summarize a bit. The 4 speakers will be organized in a sequence of case study or project presentations. So they will be mainly talking about the 5 key projects produced by PEI, and in different times, at different locations, and for different Chinese regimes. That's why I say, in a sense, in terms of a clientele, we can call the panel's themes as PEI's versions of China. So the first pair of projects was devoted for sometimes we call Taiwan or Kuomintang government. Sometimes we call the Republic of China. So the first of the 2, the Donghai University campus, especially Lu's Chapel, was produced in the 1950s in Taiwan, in Taichung of Taiwan, right after the Republic of China that recently moved from the mainland to Taiwan. It was a very special moment. So again, the second project, Osaka Expo China Pavilion, produced, finished in 1970s, and to represent the Taiwan or the Republic of China, right before Taiwan lost its official status in UN to represent China. And so then from now ongoing, PEI would switch his clientele for another China, Fragrant Hill Hotel, being the first, produced starting from the late 1970s and finished in 1982. The People's Republic of China was just opening up and to start its staggering opening up and the reform era. So the second project is equally meaningful and significant. It's finished in the year of 1989, before Hong Kong's handover. It's located in Hong Kong, before Hong Kong's handover, and a year marked with Beijing's Tiananmen Square protests. And the last project, Suzhou Museum, complete in 2006, when mainland China has already and quickly developed into a global power, which is today. So we all feel so grateful to PEI, whose life story and the body of work so rich that today they allow us today to fully appreciate the power of architecture's cultural imagination. It allows us and to really to manage to go across national borders and transcend ideological barriers. And the power of the cultural imagination binds various people like us and many other readers and audience of PEI all together. So on the other hand, I'd like to also argue today, PEI's work probably can work the other way around. The humility and the sensitivity of PEI's work not only bind us together, but also remind us constantly to respect each other's differences. And here I'd like to recommend a book published 2 years ago in Hong Kong, written by a Chinese prominent historian, Ge Zhaoguang. The title is "What is China? 何为中国?" A very timely production. I quote Mr. Ge Zhaoguang, Professor Ge Zhaoguang, based in Fudan University now. He said, "We should always emphasize that China's cultural tradition is plural rather than singular. We should resist the dangerous tendency to reduce Chinese culture into one singular type of representation, dominant by one single group of people. So the country wouldn't indulge into a self-illusion," is quote by Ge Zhaoguang, "when it's expanding into a global power." So for me, it's probably the greatest relevance for us to talk about the richness and the complexity of PEI's work today at Hong Kong. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker. Chang Qingwei, or Wei Qingchang, is a PhD candidate of Bartlett University College London. Chang was trained as architect and conferred an urban design master degree in Taiwan. His previous research addressed social production of spatial forms within non-architect consequences, everyday landscapes, and their conflicts with modernity in the contemporary built environment. His recent research focused on architectural profession and academy, Academy, with a special attention on history and the dissemination of design education in China, Europe, and the US. So let's welcome Chang Qingwei.
Good morning, everyone. The pleasure is all mine being able to join so many research colleagues and notable scholars here today in Hong Kong for IMPEI. And happen to be the first speaker. It's really a privilege indeed. My topic I'm having today is the High Modernist at Harvard GSD. So IMPEI, what the group is, and their Huadong and the Donghai universities. In an interview of 1990, Pei ever mentioned, as I quote, "I never change directions. I have continued to explore form, space, materials, and technology to make my architecture more virile, more interesting, and better," end quote. So we see the key words here: form, space, material, technology. Pei's understanding of architecture has much to do with the specific terms of Euro-American modern architecture in the early 20th century, especially those post-war discourse after the Depression. In rethinking Pei, beyond the so-called high modernist, the last master of high modernist architecture, today I would like to offer three research questions. First, what was the pre-modern landscape Pei realized before leaving China and shortly after reaching the US? And the second, what did groupies teach him at the Harvard Bauhaus after his own painstaking sojourn in the UK? And the third, what kind of modernity transplanted in Donghai University, previously Huadong University in Shanghai, by Pei and his colleagues in Taiwan? So let's begin with the pre-modern landscape of IMPEI. If we don't count Liang Shicheng and his short-lived Northeast University, Dongbei Daxue in Shenyang, before Pei went to America in 1935, China has a process architecture department at Zhongyang University, today's Southeast University, Dongnan Daxue in Nanjing, which just celebrated their 90th anniversary last month. However, Pei would attend neither of them due to their Beaux-Arts arts curriculum, as of this exercise of copy compose design, because his favorite building in the city is the Park Hotel, Guoji Fandian, designed by Lazar Udak, which was the Shanghai's first skyscraper with 24 stories, located across the street from his beloved movie theater. Seeing in this light, his decision to attend the University of Pennsylvania was hardly affected by Chinese Beaux-Arts architects like Liang Shicheng, Yang Tingbao, Tong Jun, but by another modernist Penn alumnus like Fan Wenzhao and the like, such as Dong Dayou. Professor Shen Kuan here today, who has a chapter on this Shanghai-based architect, as we see here, who's straddled freely between the big roof Shanghai Mayor building vis-a-vis Corbusier's inspired houses for his own and other well-to-do clients in French Concession, where Pei's family also lived there at the time. Corbusier's influence on Pei was further when he transferred to MIT in the fall of 1935, during which Corbusier lectured throughout the US at all these leading architecture schools. Pei even went as far as to call Corbusier's talk at MIT was the most significant event in his career. In the book Le Corbusier in America, Major Bacon interviewed IMPEI in '85 to know that his MIT thesis was actually inspired by Corbusier's village buildings. And myself might add his Mona house in the tour and architecture as well. And we see here is the IMPEI's MIT thesis, standardized propaganda units for the Chinese government, for which you can see their election here. According to Bacon's interview, Corbusier's autocomplete was available at the MIT library for Pei. In the volume from 1934 to 38, if you will, we see another project that may affect IM's Harvard thesis project, which was Corbus's the Paris Expo Pavilion. Corbusier's pupil, Paul Wildinger, who had been there, had a comment, as I quote, "The first impression is spaciousness. Regarding light, walls, shadows, trees, one does not feel like to be cut off from the outside world. And this is how we might exactly feel at the Pace Shanghai Art Museum, if ever built." Pace's move from MIT to Harvard had multiple factors. It was the dean at MIT, William Emerson, who introduced Griffiths to the AIA, American Institute of Architects in Boston in 1937. And Pace by then realized that he finally had an avant-garde modernist to follow, if not Corbusier. In addition to this, GSD student publication task published I.M. Pace's MIT thesis in 41. And the next year, in 42, Pace married Eileen Lu Shuhua, a landscape architecture student at Harvard. Taken together, Pace's high modern journey at GSD had more than casual ties with an architecture professor, a student publication, and his lifelong partner. All of this articulate to the second part of my presentation, which is the Harvard Bauhaus of Walter Griffiths. Pace ever said, as I quote, "Too many good architects, but few important ones," end quote. This may be ego, but can be wrong. Many more important architects graduated from Harvard GSD than from the Bauhaus. In addition to I.M. Pace, we have Philip Johnson, Paul Rudolph, and another notable Chinese architect, Wang Dahong, to name only his classmates here today. But it is problematic to attribute their importance to the Bauhaus stylization of modern forms, like the so-called Yale box or Harvard box revealed in these two books published around the same time in early 80s. For this boxy accusation, Harvard GSD hosted an exhibition with the title Beyond Harvard Box 10 years ago to reflect such an issue. In the article, The International Style in the 1930s, William Jordy indicated that most significant works in this regard had been built within a decade, from 1922 to 32. And obviously, the two books I show here have been all too successful, which can be confirmed by a special issue with the topic, The Heroic Period of Modern Architecture, edited by Edison and Peter Simonson in the journal Architecture Review in '65. In so arguing, if Griffiths had been relatively unproductive, here I mean less modern, while teaching at Harvard GSD, would I.M. Pace become high modern, something that he felt at Penn and at MIT under his supervision? For this, we must look back at Griffiths' sojourn in the UK. Walter Griffiths arrived in Britain in 1934 and stayed there for 3 years. As an immigration requirement, he worked together in partnership with the social-minded British architect Maxwell Frey, who ever published some journal articles on slums in the city. The apartments they designed together, we can see obviously distinct from Griffiths' own work back in Germany, which was not unlike what Jordy described, as I quote, "If the regional bias became emphatic immediately after the war," here he meant World War I, "the trend was evident among German immigrants at the end of the 30s, end quote. And this was far more the case in the States, where Griffiths and Marshall Brewer designed suburban houses, as we can see here, by adapting modern idiom into the fieldstone masonry, as well as carpenter vernacular of the New England. Through the light of this new approach, not surprisingly that Griffiths would encourage I.M. Pace to challenge modern to be high modern, for which I may define by the praise of Pace's thesis project from Walter Griffiths, as I quote, "An able designer can very well hold on to basic traditional features without sacrificing the conception, the progressive conception of design," end quote. Indeed, the Harvard Bauhaus had become more physically comfortable while revealing a greater concern with history, as well as assuming more diversity of aspects. And all of these efforts culminate at this conference planning man's physical environment at Princeton University by 1947. Here we see not only the group is in the middle, we see the Hunnert, third, Alto, Wright, and Gideon. And not least, the one and only Chinese representative, Liang Sicheng, was also there. All of these heavyweights work together to craft a second modernism, if you will, or the so-called environmental design later on. Pei wasn't at the event, but I believe in Professor Eric Mumford's talk about Pei's urban design work this afternoon, we will know more about the impact of a Harvard Bauhaus through a larger scope of design of built environments. So this Princeton conference in 40s now trends outside into the 50s, which triggers the part of the core of my presentation, concerned with the transplanted modernity at Huadong and Donghai University. Before Pei's architecture directorship at William Zuckendorf's Wackenab company, the Architect Cooperative, TAC, was commissioned a project by 1946 that Pei and Wang Dahong joined groups to discuss, and that was the Huadong University in Shanghai. But ultimately, it was Pei who became the associate architect on behalf of TAC for the client, United Board of Christian College in China, UBCCC. Yet the project was unfortunately turned down due to China's civil war. In 1949, Mao Zedong forced nationalist government, Kuomintang, moved to Taiwan and shut down all missionary universities on the mainland. In 1952, UBCCC decided to establish a joint institution in Excel in Free China Formosa, nowadays Donghai University in Taiwan. This time, they contact Pei directly rather than TAC. On the one hand, that was due to the close friendship between Pei and Dr. William Fang, who was the executive secretary of UBCCC. On the other hand, UBCCC would like a brand new kind of campus, different from those palatial style, 宫殿式, designed by American architect Harry Murphy on the mainland, for which Pei's modernist training, as well as the Chinese background, make him the distinct architect. However, the story was more complicated through archival research and some literature available only in Mandarin. Before serving as the architect, Pei was one of the judges for the Donghai Design Competition in the February '54. Together with Canadian architect Henry Hersey, they selected the proposal of Corbusier's Japanese Purple, Takamasa Yoshisaka, Jiban Longzheng, but announced all submissions, including the winners, fell behind criteria. Moreover, Pei turned out to be the architect in charge on the same day when the judgment was made, according to reference conference records. So in terms of authorship and partnership, Pei seemed to be well prepared and all set for this commission. More than once, Pei emphasized his role at Huadong University through publication. First in Japan's Interior in '52, and later in Taiwan's Architecture Today in '54. In both cases, Pei was placed ahead of TAC, even without mentioning groupings at all. However, the last living TAC co-founder, John Huggins, who just passed away 1 year ago, added the Water Groupings Archive. It's volume 4 devoted to the work of TAC from 1945 to '69, in which TAC librarian King Tinney introduced Huadong University, not only the first project you will see if you read the book, but also a TAC project, as we see here in the catalog, that group has had a major part. Exactly the day on which Pei became the principal architect, he had been able to announce two Chinese associate architects, Zhang Zhaokang and Chen Qikuan. Together with Pei, I call them Donghai 3 hereafter. Based on Pei's previous Huadong hands-on experience and what he brought back to New York, the data he brought back to New York from Taiwan, Donghai 3 successfully proposed an overall campus planning for Donghai University in '54, which was published next year in Taiwan as we can see here. Either of these earliest drawings, we can already see the diamond-like round bus indicating the location of the famous Luce Chapel on campus. Alongside many similarities with Huadong University back in Shanghai, such as the small group of low buildings and multiple long access typology and covered walkway connection and so forth special patterns, even including a prototype of the chapel together with the bell tower. However, Pei's role at Donghai was much less than the case at Huadong. According to Han Baode, who's standing next to Pei here, in an interview he indicated Pei only determined the Jefferson Boulevard, like that at the University of Virginia, as well as the compound courtyard college with a square platform base that he learned in Japan. But originally from China's Song Dynasty, as we can see here at the bottom right, through Liu Songlian's ink painting hundreds of years ago. In the Chinese version of the book, Conversation with I.M. Pei, translator Lin Bing, who is also here today, offers us an exclusive Mandarin dialogue with I.M. Pei, who said, as I quote, "I provide only the initial planning at Donghai University, where Chen Qiquan and Zhang Zhaokang carry out the specific design later on," end quote. Despite the above similarities we just pointed out, in what follows we will see whatever we could distinguish Donghai from Huadong in some ways. Pei's textureless containers of space at Huadong reminds us of his GSD thesis, in which he also placed an artificial lake surrounded by trees and shrubs to create a formalistic result of the Chinese garden. But it was Zhang Zhaokang who embedded Donghai University with more Chineseness. For example, not only did he change a single pitch roof into double without upturned edge, underneath the black tile roof, he also created the image of a bracket, traditional bracket dogong, by concrete, plus final touches like these carefully cut angles, as we can see here on the brick, on the concrete, and so forth craftsmanship throughout the walkways, like this latest work vis-a-vis his own sketching details. So seeing in this light, Zhang Zhaokang was surely the one bearing most Chineseness among the Donghai three, whereas Chen Qiquan was the one serving on campus for the longest time in total, during which he also established the architecture department in 1960. On the right here, we see a letter from Walter Gropius forwarding his congrats to Chen Qiquan in Taiwan regarding the establishment of the new architecture school. Chen Qiquan's contribution to I.M. Pei at the Donghai University was particularly well known at the Luce Chapel, whose copyright is therefore still highly debated nowadays. In Lin's interview, again, Pei insisted that this only project's image of the Luce Chapel he hangs in his office. The Luce Chapel, as I quote, was completely designed by himself, end quote. That is certain, I have to say, because Pei's proposal for the chapel has been finalized and published in Architecture Forum early in the March of '57, as well displayed in Taiwanese newspaper next year in '58. However, as we can see here on the right, the letter, in 1959, the project was rejected by Henry Luce Foundation, concerned with the humid and the warm climate in Taiwan when it came to a timber construction. As architecture department chair and a field architect at Donghai University, Chen Qiquan was supposed to take it over and redesign it by concrete. The original design of Pei, as we can see, published in the journal on the left, was a steel wooden structure, which reminds us of his MIT thesis vis-a-vis Corbusier's temporary installation in Paris we just see earlier, both a structural nation based on prefabricated elements that Pei continued to elaborate at Harvard in his own early practice. Through this case I provide here, you can see such a standardized design made full sense for intended rapid construction, since the university was in a rush to open. But finally, it took another 3 years to redesign the chapel, which eventually relied on Chen Qi-Kuan's close cooperation with a Taiwanese specialist in concrete, Feng Houshan, as clearly indicated in Dr. Fang's letter here on the right to the Luz Foundation. After all, Donghai 3 had Wang Dahong to thank. When Taiwanese advisory board preferred Murphy-like campus design, it was Wang Dahong who supported their modern design proposal for the sake of UBCCC. Furthermore, when Pace's German engineer in New York couldn't fix the technical calculation at the Luz Chapel, it was Wang Dahong again who introduced his own engineer, Feng Houshan, to assist Chen Qi-Kuan in Taiwan. What's more, as indicated in the letter from Dr. Fang's associate Mary Ferguson to IMPEI, we realized that PEI originally wanted Wang Dahong to be the field architect at the Donghai University in Taiwan. But the suggestion was unsuccessful as a result. For this, I ever consult with Professor Kurt Roskin this May by email. Whatever PEI may come behind Water Group's back to get the Donghai project. And Wang Dahong decided to decline the commission accordingly, for which we may refer to this exclusive preface written by Wang Dahong himself 20 years ago for the Chinese version of Michael Cannon's famous book, Mandarin of Modernism. With the title, The Most Outstanding Classmate, IMPEI, Wang Dahong recalled, as I quote, "After many years, the commission was in PEI's hand for undisclosed reason, and of course this opposite group is," end quote. Nevertheless, not only IMPEI, Wang Dahong was also Group's favorite student, whoever invited us a critique at his master studio here. And he was also one of the earliest discussants of the Huadong project. Their mentorship can be highlighted by this handwritten letter by Water Group's sent 1 year before his death to this underappreciated Chinese architect Wang Dahong of past generation, who is also celebrating his 100th birthday this year. That was a piece from the Greek poet George Severus, ending by, as I quote, "It is time now for us to say the few words we have to say, because tomorrow our soul sets sail," end quote. In conclusion, at the Donghai University, this authorship versus partnership tension expresses a very unique landscape of architecture modernity in post-war free China, and what I call to be modern project through the context of Pax Americana, of Cold War, and American aid in Taiwan. Nevertheless, what makes Donghai a think tank of modern architecture today was far beyond the design discipline per se, but the cross-national networking in cooperative process of all of these high modernists from the past century. As we see here, Chen Qi-Kuan and Zhang Zhaokang traveled back and forth to Taiwan, where Wang Dahong provided them with some local assistance. And IMPEI was by then also occupied by his own projects in the US, but visit the campus in Taichung from time to time, as this brief itinerary I provide here. And also at the same time, Gropius and Marshall Brewer worked together with Corbusier for the UNESCO building in Paris. At the bottom right, by the way, we have a very special photo of IMPEI, of his one and only lecture in Taiwan by 54 at the Cheung Kong University, whose architecture school is now in charge by Professor Wu, our next speaker. Unlike Chen Qi-Kuan at Zhongyang University or Zhang Zhaokang at St. John's University in China before their overseas training, PEI never studied professional program on his motherland. Instead, he walked into deep steps of Gropius in terms of their dislike of style. In 1937, Gropius explained his pedagogy at JSD as I quote, "I would never call for a Gropius architecture, but to introduce a method of design of approach which is unbiased, original, and elastic, end quote. Likewise, though bearing the title of the last master of high modernist architecture, but IMP wants to be remembered not as a late modernist, as I quote, but for giving new life to modernism, end quote, said himself half a century later than Gropius, however with the same mindset. Pei doesn't talk much about his design as we know, and he writes little. In ending my talk, however, here comes a very rare formal publication of IMP in the beginning of Marshall Burroughs' memoir, which is a very brief, by no means academic foreword that I would like to share in the end. So as I quote, Burroughs, his wife Connie, and Eileen and I sailed to Greek islands together. We promised each other not to have alcohol on board and to avoid the discussion of architecture. But we consumed copious amount of ouzo on shore and marvel at the play of sunlight on foam. Is that not the essence of architecture? This is indeed one of the most tantalizing statements about architecture I ever had so far. So since the point has never been what architecture is for Pei, but conversely what he means to architecture as a subject, as a profession, but also as a way of life. And not least, how he gathered all of us under one roof here today. I think this explains everything. So happy birthday, Mr. Pei, and thank you all for listening. Cheers, thank you.
Thank you, Chen Wei. Our next speaker is Professor Wu Guangting. He's the director of the architectural design program in the Department of Architecture, as Chen Wei mentioned, at the National Cheng Kung University. His research focuses on the post-1945 architecture in Taiwan. He was the founding chief editor for ARC, ARCH, former chief editor of Architecture Taiwan, and the former editing advisor of Taiwanese Architect. He has also held positions as director of the Taipei Fine Arts Museum and the chairman of the board of the Chinese Institute of Urban Design. Professor Wu holds a degree in architecture from University of Michigan. In 2016, he was elected as a fellow of the Architectural Institute of Taiwan. Let's welcome Professor Wu.
Yeah, thank you to 2000 introduction. And before the screen comes out, I must say I think there are many experts and scholars in this world who are familiar with IMP's works, but however, very few people in the world have ever remembered the China Pavilion made by IMP in 1960. So this is my, therefore the theme I share today is this masterpiece that disappeared from the history. Yeah. Thank you. Before sharing, let's review the history of China Pavilion, represent ROC, Republic of China, and before we lost UN. This is what the image we have ever seen before. 1900 World Expo Chinese Pavilion, and this is the 1915 World Expo Chinese Pavilion. So this is seems to me is almost unchanged image of the China Pavilion as a world exposition for nearly an entire century. This simply, this 1964 Chinese Pavilion in New York World Expo. So these simply conservative attitudes began to change in Taiwan in 1960s. Architect Lu Yijun tried to preserve the Chinese features in the classic features of Chinese architecture, but they are doing something inside, like this kind of modern design inside the building. For example, in this case, architects converted the plan of a polygon into a circular plan and exposed the walkway as part of its architectural form, like this. So you can see sorry, you can see the walkway comes out from the inside the plane, and it comes out from the outside as exposed as a walkway and the elevation element here. So all the story comes about from the 1968 May. The open call of the design submission for the Chinese pavilion at the Osaka World Expo public announcement, published by the Central Daily News and the several and the United Daily News. They have set on the June 15 as a deadline for the submission, and the several requirements. One of the most important requirement is the number third should adopt modern architecture style for the Osaka Expo. So here, I will say the culture is the core issue of the reconstruction of the national state. USA to Taiwan from 1951 to 1965 is a key program, is a key aid program to fully modernize Taiwan. However, modernization does not mean to westernization. The most crucial core issue is how to maintain the characteristic of Chinese culture for the sake of.
We can't hear you without the microphone.
Okay. For the sake of the complete national state reconstruction. So this was also the main context where the state laid the reconstruction for national identity and image through leadership in the project of the Chinese pavilion of the Osaka Expo 1970. At the same time, it also formed an opportunity for the all-around development of modern architecture in Taiwan in the future. So this is PEI comes back in the July 3rd. He invited by the government Taiwan and plan to. Yeah. So this gentleman is PEI's father, Bei Zuyi. When he stayed in Taiwan, he comes to airport to see around the PEI and his wife and daughter. And this time he comes back for the jury, and July 8th he took place for the open call for design submission for the Chinese pavilion at Osaka World Expo. July 9th, we seen the paper published the result of the competition. A total of 27 submissions, architecture and submissions, and the first prize was Xiong Qiwei, who was represented by the atelier at Cambridge. Second place was Su Zhe, and third place was Yu Yue. So this comes the first place draft design drawings of the Chinese pavilion by Atelier Cambridge. This is the whole drawings, about 18 panels. They study about the program, they study about the concept diagram, they study about the design principle, they study about the concept diagram, and also they provide a very fully site plan. So we can see the China pavilion is in here. And architecture drawings, roof, and the ground floor. So we can see the draft design is a plan is entered from here, and comes out the second floor has an exhibition area, whole second floor, and they're using a kind of a ramp to connect the different floor height from here to here, A to B, and ramp to C, and ramp to D, and ramp to the resting space, and then going to the other side of the exhibition space. This is the basement plan, and this is the section join, and this is the perspective is joined by the Li Zuyuan and models like. And this is the second place, draft design drawings of the by the Suze. So you can see the perspective drawings looks like a wood structure, like has a kind of a bracket system of the dogong, like out of the form. This is the third place, the draft design of the by the Yu Yue Zhen. And the after the jury in the July 17, they have the committee has a very important meeting and make some a decision. The most important decision is this here: the Chinese pavilion will not follow the design of the top three winners and will be designed by architect Ian Pei and his overseas firm. That means Ian Pei will take over the whole design things. And here I discuss this case. The Pei entrusted by the government and solely responsible for the design of Chinese pavilion. Pei decide the design direction and interior plan, as well as feature contents of the Chinese pavilion, and choose Peng Yingxuan to represent Pei's firm, and Li Zuyuan to represent Atelier Cambridge to be representatives of the cooperation design team, as well as another 3 interior designers who formed as a task force. Pei was in charge of the project and act as the coordinator, building a team that regarded the design of the Chinese pavilion as a curatorial project. This also explains why the authorized official album of the Osaka World Expo 97 lists Peng Yingxuan and Li Zuyuan as the architects of the Chinese pavilion rather than Pei. And so after the jury go back to New York, and in July sometime, I cannot confirm when, but Pei met with the winning team at Taylor Cambridge at his firm in New York, determining the team-plus-team cooperation model, where Pei's firm provides support and Pei serves as a leader and the coordinator of the project. Li Zuyuan and Zhu Jun, who is one of the Atelier Cambridge member, joined the team on behalf of the winning team. But later on, about 1 week or 2 weeks after, Peng Yingxuan and Li Zuyuan set up the design team under Pei's instruction. The team consists of the 2 divisions. Peng and Li were in charge of the architectural design and construction supervision, and the other people responsible for the interior display and design, preliminary design, was completed in November 1968. And this is in November 1968, the version of the design draft drawing was presented to the Minister of Li Guoding, who is the committee chairman and the journalist. So we can see this design is very elegant. They're using a very the typical geometric form divided to the 2 triangle form. Enter from A and exit from J. If you enter from A and exit from J, you can fill in the landscape here, water pond and the tea terrace and the cafeteria here. It's a very elegant design. So we can see the second floor plan. When you enter from A and you pass from B and bridge to C and to D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and comes out from the J here to the fourth floor plan from out and walk down the circular space of the J from to outside of the here, and you can see the section. The several different the exhibition space is connected by the bridge. And later on, they have a more study about the first scheme, and they find out if the expo site will be here, and because it's nearly the main plaza, so many people will come out from the main plaza. Because of the movement reason, they have a change of the design like this. So you just enter from A and comes out from J. The same building here, two triangle form as a geometric space, but here it's changed. There's no water pump, and there's no tea space. They just only have the other triangle space for the restaurant here. So you can see the section, and also you can see the diagram. From here, you can read if you enter from A, it's upstairs down to the different level of the exhibition space, and comes out from the J here, and goes out from here and to the outside. And this is a photo which PEI returned to Taiwan at noon of the November 13, 1968, and there's team members to report the design result to the Minister of Economic Affairs and the committee members at the afternoon. This is November 16. PEI and his team members held a press conference at the Government Information Office to explain the design result of the Chinese pavilion. And this is a great image. This is PEI and his team. This is Li Zuyuan, the Peng Yingxuan, and the three interior designers take a photo with the model of the building. And he visited the vice president, also the prime minister of the Yan Jiagan, as well in the November, and have a party with them. And PEI the next day, PEI's press conference is published in the newspaper. Say PEI talking about the Chinese pavilion has a great outlooking and have a very clear layer of the space, and this is very positive for the PEI's press conference presentation. And this is a cover of the special issue of the World Expo Chinese Pavilion of the special book. Here's the photo of the designers, and if you can read Japanese, you can see here this Japanese says PEI is a coordinator, and Peng Yingxuan and Li Zuyuan is an architect. And these are the three designers. So in the formal editorial committee of the Second Architecture Japan. So we can see from this book, it's a China Pavilion. It's the architect here is Peng Yingxuan and Li Zuyuan. In the mid-March, the Chinese pavilion broke ground, and the contractor is Obayashi Corporation, Japan. This is 1970 March 15. The World Expo opened, and you can see several black and white photos here of the outside looking and the inside. And the Daily News has a very big paragraph to talking about the World Expo, what happened in the March 15. Basically, the Japanese Prime Minister Sato says the Chinese pavilion is a very good in design, and present the new China culture, prosperity. And this is the poster of the Chinese pavilion. Also something design, and here I was talking about the how the Chinese pavilion Chinese, when the design did not adopt the traditional palace style of the architecture style. I think it's a very humble thing in the beginning. He was sincerely and naturally reveals that we did not intentionally express the traditional Chinese style, for we have all been cultivated in the Chinese culture for many years and have naturally inject the Chinese spirit and the features into the work. Secondly, I think it is more important than to transform Chinese of the Chinese pavilion into something peaceful and intangible and used to traditional Chinese garden. I think it's Suzhou Garden as the theme to project a Chinese cultural imagination on the level of the literature and the philosophy onto the design theme of the Chinese needs of the Chinese pavilion, to replace the vulgar and the festive, realistic and the classical play style. Here we can see the other kind of the paradigm comes out is a bare wall Chinese garden, and to replace the palace style things as a imagination of the Chinese culture, of the architecture. So I think not only they complete the curatorial actions for the reconstruction of the national state through the design process of the Chinese pavilion, you further realize the design expressed on the spatial culture of modern China, quote, through the spatial form of the pavilion. It's a conclusion. I think the temporal meaning of the design in Chinese pavilion. I say if we try to place Chinese pavilion among Pei's works, we should realize that the Everson Museum of the Art not only serves as a prototype of the Chinese pavilion, it also drove the overall design of the Chinese pavilion to extend and evolve into a design exhibition venue with the verified and the layered display levels. Secondly, the Chinese pavilion remains an architecture event instead of an entity to Taiwan. I think this is more important than. And it leads to a value and influence of paradigm shift introduced by the architecture to the society. So my conclusion, we should realize that utilize the ideas with deep cultural meanings to transform to meet the needs of the time in the modern architecture spatial form. And this is not, this is the most valuable experience we have learned from the design process of the Chinese pavilion. So let's review his sister project from 1946. He's talking about the culture and space. And almost 20 years about, he built the Everson Museum. And I read it from the IMP company works, and IMP says this is like a courtyard house in Beijing. And few image of the Donghai University, which I think in the same time, because the Chinese pavilion built in 1970, it almost the same time we can see the Donghai University completed. And you can see this a drawing by Chen Qi-Kuan. He used a brush painting to represent the campus of the Donghai, like the village, agricultural village of the China. So you can see the Ruth Chapel here, and you can see some of the Buddhist buildings here. This is Donghai University, College of Literature, corridor, things, and administration of the present house, old library. So you can see the roof is a wood structure. So this is the Luz Chapel right now here. So if you come back to the site of Osaka, you can see this kind of view, like a cemetery yard. Say Zhonghua Minguo Guan is a Chinese pavilion was here, and has a photo here to memorize the site. So this is the last photo, which I say it's like ex-fighters. They done great things before, and yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Guangting. Our next speaker, Zhuandu or Du Juan, is Associate Professor in the Department of Architecture and Associate Dean for International and Mainland China Affairs in the Faculty of Architecture at the Hong Kong U. Her research and writings have been published in China, Europe, and the States, including China Voices, Urban Transformations, Dharmas International, Urban China, and the Journal of Architectural Education. She's also the founding director of the Hong Kong-based office, IDU Architecture, with projects ranging from the extent of built forms to the social ecological processes of the city. Let's welcome Du Juan. Yeah.
Thank you, Tao. While this is being loaded up, please get to. I would like to first acknowledge a few people to thank. The first two is the structural engineer Guy Nordenson in 2011, and the structural engineer Leslie Robertson, who is the structural engineer for the Bank of China building, which I'm going to speak about. And they really have sparked my interest in the building a decade before I would come to the city for the first time. So it's quite an interesting thing. So I also would like to thank then this year to thank M+, Harvard GSD, and my colleagues at Hong Kong U for organizing this IMPEI symposium that allows me to revisit a project I had examined almost two decades ago. So I thanks to those individuals and institutions. Thank you. Oh, at the pointer is which one? Okay, great. All right. So the title for the talk is a tower for modern China, and then I shall explain that title a bit later. I'd like to just organize it around three things that the architect who worked with IMPEI, which is Mr. Sandy Pei, who is in the audience with us today, who has really graciously allowed me to have an in-depth interview with him about the process of the construction and the design of the building. And throughout the conversation, Sandy repeatedly spoke about that above all things, it was the time, place, and purpose of each individual building that IMPEI and the office in general have very much been focused on, and that's kind of the guiding principle, which on its surface seems quite standard and non-confrontational. What I would like to show through this talk to you is that the time, place, and purpose of the Hong Kong's Bank of China is anything but benign, that it was hopefully a wild ride, and for the architects, but also for the audience today. So the time seems innocuous. 1982 was when IMPEI was approached for the project, and it was completed in 1989. So it is on this year of 1989 I would like to start the talk. In an article titled "A Year of Years for the High Priest of modernism, the New York Times architecture critic Paul Goldberg marveled that 1989 was the year of I Am Pei. He marveled at the opening of the controversial glass pyramid at the Louvre in Paris, the Meyerson Symphony Center in Dallas, as well as the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong. Stunning year indeed, especially considering there were a few buildings left out by Goldberg's article, namely the CEA headquarters in Los Angeles, the Childt Science Center in Connecticut, and the Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City, all completed within the same year of 1989. It was a remarkable year in a remarkable decade. It was also the year Francis Fukuyama, a LA-based political scientist, marked as the year that is the end of history, due to what he has declared as the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism and democracy. Based on events throughout the decades, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and especially noting, but the power of the liberal idea or ideal would seem much less impressive if it had not infected the largest and oldest culture in Asia, China. This decade-long global enthusiasm for change that culminated in the mid-1989 also impacted I Am Pei's working relationship with the Chinese government. For the Bank of China, Pei was opposed by the Chinese government in 1982. It was the second time Pei was asked by the government to design a tower. The first time was in 1974. The request was to build the first skyscraper in Beijing, located near the Forbidden City. Pei declined and made a plea not to construct any tall buildings within the historic center. In an interview years later, he noted, "I'm very proud of that one. Since then, no tall buildings has been allowed within the vicinity of the Forbidden City. I consider this my most important contribution." Pei then accepted the work on a periphery site, the work from the government on a periphery site for the Fergan Hill Hotel, completed in 1989. In the same year, Pei accepted the Bank of China project, knowing it would be an immense challenge. In an interview years later on the project, Pei stated, "The challenge for me, frankly speaking, was architectural. Only a few years before, our neighbor, the HSBC Tower, had just completed its new headquarters by Norman Foster to wide acclaim. I admit with some embarrassment today that I felt compelled to respond even with limited means and a less than ideal site." The Bank of China Tower is a significant study of design with constraint and with the site that is both at the local scale, the land parcel, the urban scale of the central district, as well as the harbor and city beyond. It also was a significant study of working within a very specific economic and political constraints of the project. The HSBC building by Norman Foster was an exquisite project with prefabricated structural steel components made in the UK and further detailed fittings prefabricated in Japan, then shipped to Hong Kong. Encouraged and supported by the client, the building was estimated to have cost over $650 million US. Prior to the design of the Bank of China building, however, the construction budget was already announced to be at 1 billion Hong Kong or 130 million US. Considering that the Bank of China is a state-owned, therefore funded by the central government, the considerably lower budget may be surprising from today's perspective. However, the China in the 1980s was a worlds away from today's second largest economy. The government and the people were in deep poverty, just on the heels of the disastrous Cultural Revolution. It was not a global ambition compelled. It was not a global economic ambition that compelled Deng Xiaoping and others in the government to launch the economic reforms and to open up the country. It was simply to improve the standard of living for the masses that has suffered through a decade of starvation. When HSBC commissioned Foster, their only instruction was, please build the best bank building in the world. For the Bank of China, the bank's representative simply asked Pei to design an iconic building that maximizes the FAR of the land plot. With a limited budget combined with a very difficult site, there were no demands from the government or expectations to build a building of any significant height. Especially taking into consideration that due to the region's frequent typhoons, the wind load requirement for tall buildings over 300 meters were more than double that of New York City and Chicago. Yet, the construction budget available for the building was far less than the typical skyscraper, definitely significant less, you can see from the HSBC Tower, its neighbor. So this is the site for the Bank of China, right next to the HSBC. For a building that instigated countless public agitation in Hong Kong, the site was the first offense. It started with the land sale price of 1 million Hong Kong dollars, significantly less to standard market value at the time, and the sale was directly from the British government to the Chinese government. The general perception was that it was far below market value, and therefore indicated the British government's willingness to hand the island back to China, a deal which was not confirmed until 2 years later with the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. It was reported that on the day after the announcement of the land sale of the Bank of China piece of land, Hong Kong stock market's Hang Seng Index fell 80 points. And the Hong Kong dollar lost 1.5% its value. And this was reported by bankers who were living in Hong Kong at the time and who were writing home to announce, to tell their friends back home in London about the land sale. However, some held the opposite view of the intentions for the choice of the land parcel. The land address seems perfectly pleasant. The address is number 1 Garden Road, Central. And Pei's description of the site being less than ideal, I think, was one of the greatest understatement about the project. So please look at this address. Murray House 1, Garden Road. The land was in fact the site of Hong Kong's historic Murray House. Constructed by the British Royal Navy as officer quarters of the adjacent military barracks in 1844, it was one of the oldest surviving Victorian buildings in Hong Kong. While it held the highest grade of Hong Kong's historic structures, it was a building people tended to avoid due to its use by the Japanese military police during the 1941 to 1945 occupation of Hong Kong as a prison and execution facility. The building held such negative reputations of being haunted that the British government paid for extraordinary high fees of exorcism ceremonies, both in the years of 1963 and in the year 1974. With continued negative public perception, the Murray House was finally taken apart in January 1982 and not resurrected until 2 decades later in 2002 across Hong Kong Island in the southern seafront development of Stanley. So today you can go visit this previously haunted building, although it seems that history has completely been erased out of people's mind along with the relocation of this particular building. Despite the many challenges, I.M. Pei noted, I quote, "This site has one important advantage. Because it was located just out of the airport's flight path, the new building was not restricted by the height limits imposed on all buildings to the north of the building. A tall building would permit us to overlook some of the most prestigious buildings of Hong Kong with the panoramic view of the harbor and Kowloon beyond. Recognizing that going tall was the only way to create a landmark with the building for the city, Pei came up with a tower that was at once simplistic yet expressive. But first, he had to deal with the site. According to Sandy Pei, one of the first tasks for the design of the building was to negotiate with Hong Kong's planning department to add a new road to the south side for access. Then there were the long negotiation with the lands department to adjust the land demarcation to reshape the land parcel into a more manageable parallelogram. Still not ideal, but at least the building could have now a decent footprint that allows the tower to be oriented straight north-south, in alignment with most of the buildings in the surrounding and addressing the harbor to the north. With the possibility of a square footprint that takes up as much as possible the small site, Pei divided the square with one of his go-to geometry, the triangle. While declaring it is not his favorite form, as is often a question that's asked of him during countless interviews, Pei did admit to, quote, that he does like the triangle for its rigidity in the structural sense. In 1982, back at his country home in New York's Westchester County, Ian Pei had multiple conversations with his son, Sandy Pei, whom at the time has already worked for years at Ian Pei and Partners. They divided the square plan with 2 diagonals, ending with 4 triangular quadrants. Then, Ian Pei asked Sandy to cut 4 wooden sticks with triangular sections. He remarked in multiple occasions that the tapered form at the Bank of China Tower came from a common Chinese metaphor of bamboo used to denote growth and strength. This is a rare project that Pei would use a metaphor in reasoning and describing the design of any of his buildings. It's a point I will come back to later. To create the taper, Pei shifted the 4 triangular sections so that each section reached a different height in sequence, ending with one singular triangular shaft to mark the top section. As per their discussions, once back at the New York city office, Sandy Pei then used thin strips of black charpet graphic art tape, I love that, to indicate large diagonal bracings, which you can see on the models that were created. Then they were ready to meet with the structural engineer Leslie Robertson, a long-term collaborator working with them on the Meyerson Symphony Hall at the time. Ian Pei's intuition that the triangular sections makes for a good structural sense was verified by Robertson. He was enthusiastic for the formal composition and thought it was a practical and ingenious solution to the various demands of the project. Robertson then created designs for innovative structural details that was instrumental to allow for the overall formal geometry to remain one sculptural yet simple. The appearance of simplicity was achieved through an innovative megastructure system made up of, which we can see here, made up of vertical columns, diagonal bracing, and horizontal stiffening plates. And contrary to the often misstated number of 4, there are actually 5 columns in the Bank of China Tower. So in addition to the 4 corners, there's this one in the center, which become expressed at the very top. For the modern Bank of China BOC Tower, Robertson designed unique connection details. And I'm going to show you the details through some of the construction photos, as I thought that they are a little bit more dramatic than the drawings. He designed a joint of steel encasement with poured-in-place concrete at the same material composite as the vertical columns. As typical with all tall buildings, the lateral wind load of the building increases with the increase in height in relationship to its vertical load of gravity. This is especially true in Hong Kong. A tall building system typically needs two structural systems, columns for vertical load and cross-bracing or reinforced horizontal plates for lateral load. Leslie Robertson's structural details allowed all members to work together as a singular three-dimensional system that allowed for maximum structural efficiency. As a result, the tower would end up using less than half of the steel used in the typical Hong Kong tall buildings of the time, and multiple times less than the 30,000 tons used for the HSBC building. For those who have been to the top floor of the BOC tower, on the left two images is that very top during construction. Sorry, it's a little bit out of sequence. Quite pleased with the structural ingenuity of the tower on the otherwise minimalistic exterior envelope of the curtain wall, the designers decided the structural members of the vertical columns, diagonal bracing, and major horizontal plates will be expressed with polished aluminum metal plates as the only decorative element of the tower. The bottom three floors of the tower were enveloped with granite cladding in height contrast with the metal and glass tower above. Two sunken gardens were created with a seemingly awkward triangular leftover space to the east and west side of the land parcel. The lower ground entrance to the north of the tower was designed for for access for the rental offices floors, while the higher ground to the south of the tower was for the general public customers as well as for the offices of the bank itself. The orientation and height of each triangular section of the tower were carefully positioned in consideration how it would be perceived from the main view corridors of the city. The most sculptural facade were turned to views from the Statue Square and the Star Ferry Terminal. Most importantly, the tower would stand at 367 meters in height, creating not only the tallest tower in Hong Kong, but the fourth tallest building in the world at the time. From multiple positions, both locally at the Central District and at the city scale, the Bank of China Tower would become one of the most distinct forms in Hong Kong skyline. It would eventually become a true landmark building in Hong Kong. However, when the tower of great height yet seemingly simple and restrained design was shown in public, a storm of shock and condemnation immediately ensued. Ian Pei and his collaborators were caught off guard. Pei would later comment that the criticism of the initial Bank of China Tower was comparable to the tremendous public criticism his designs for the glass pyramid entrance at the Louvre in Paris. In Hong Kong, Pei's design had to face the wrath of one of the most powerful special groups in Hong Kong, the Feng Shui Masters. They very much launched a public campaign. So as a conceit to the Feng Shui Masters, which very much criticized the design, and the biggest criticism was the diagonal bracings expressed on the building's facade, it was seen as X's, so a symbol of death. So along with Leslie Robertson, Ian Pei decided, let's just remove the diagonals so that the crosses become diamonds, something that they had hoped would appease the local public. It didn't do much to appease the Feng Shui Masters. This is the sunken gardens that's very much invisible unless you're really standing next to the building that has created such a great ground condition as well. So I get to my last point of the purpose of the building, which seems simple. It's a bank. It's a tower for the bank. What can we say about that purpose? And I like to make an argument that for Ian Pei, accepting the commission for this particular building was not just designing a tower for a bank. It was creating a more, his hope of working with a country that was under reform and opening up. After getting back on track with the building design and finally broke ground in 1985, from labor and material shortages to a continuing hostile local press, the Bank of China Tower faced numerous other pressures throughout the following years. I.M. Pei seemed to have dealt with all of them with diplomacy and matter-of-factness. These traits have resulted in some praise, while at the same time, Pei also garnered a reputation for being too indifferent to social conflicts, too corporate, too artistic individualities, and too modern for traditional cultures, such as being Chinese. What the critics who have described Pei's body of work as being un-Chinese do not understand is that I.M. Pei is a self-proclaimed American architect, but yet he is also passionate about his country of birth. This simultaneous duality seems to be difficult for those who only think in opposing binaries. The same could be said for those who mistake I.M. Pei's gentleness in outward mannerism for a lack of resilient personal position. I.M. Pei did not write much. He preferred to work rather than writing about work. Nearly all quoted words by Pei are from recorded interviews. However, he did write an op-ed in the 1989 June 22nd edition of the New York Times newspaper. It was entitled, "China Won't Ever Be the Same." It was in response to the Tiananmen incident just a few weeks earlier in Beijing. Pei opened with a personal introduction that were more fundamental to him than being an architect. Quote, "More than 50 years ago, my wife and I came to this wonderful country from China. For 40 of those years, we dreamed that one day it would be possible to work in our native land. More than anything, we wanted to combine our love of the nation that had come to become our own with our desire to do something for our land of birth and heritage. We wanted to believe a more open and modern China was possible. We worked with China, despite many frustrations, out of a love of that country, out of a sense that things were getting better. We believed that the more we worked with the leadership, the more would be opened up for the rest of the people." The anger and disappointment of the rest of Pei's short piece towards the Chinese government was vivid. Considering the Bank of China Tower was just a few months away from finishing after years of delay and difficulties, to speak out so publicly against the very government that hired him would be surprising to those who thought of I.M. Pei as being apolitical, or usually more gently worded, diplomatic to a fault. However, this quality of I.M. Pei was not surprising to his family or to one of his closest friends, the Chinese-American activist Henry Tang, who knows Pei to be deeply interested in international affairs. However, he was surprised by the fact that after years asking Pei to be the public face of Chinese-American activism, Pei came to Tang's office in the days following June 4th to say he was ready to head up and form an organization. Henry Tang eagerly agreed to support, as I quote him, Henry Tang, "There were almost no organizations with Chinese-American individuals putting their faces and names on the line to dialogue about this particular issue. I dare to say there were none." The organization formed will become the influential Chinese-American group, the Committee of 100. That started in June 1989 with just 6 people. In addition to Pei and Tang, there were also investment banker Oscar Tan, General Motors executive Li Shirley Yang, cellist and musician Yo-Yo Ma, and the late Columbia University physics professor, Professor Wu. In the years following, the Committee of 100 became a cultural channel between the highest levels of governments in Washington, Beijing, and Taipei, often during times when the formal diplomatic channels were not working. Through his New York Times declaration and his funding committee of 100, Pei acted upon his cultural identity as being Chinese and American. He was very proud of his work and still is involved in the operations. This is a photo from the, I believe, his 25th anniversary a few years ago of the Committee of 100. So I come back to this this symbolism of the bamboo. I believe the symbolism I would like to believe, and I like to have a conversation about it, that it was not just formal and pictorial. There's a famous saying in Chinese, bamboo after rain, 雨后春竹. And it essentially denotes a sense of hope, a sense of change, a sense of something great to come after a long period of darkness and drought. So the Bank of China building today, as we have come to see it, it has become very much a symbol of the city. It has characteristics that allows you to be able to view it from different sides, never really quite sure, to most people, what exactly is the geometry and the structural system of the building. And I would like to conclude with a quote from Ian Pei, and it is a rare one. He would discuss this aspect. Hidden in plain sight, like the heart column at the Bank of China Tower, Ian Pei's conviction as an architect and as an individual is strong and resilient. In a 2004 interview with the Chinese literary journal, China Youth, Ian Pei describes his reason to remain modest when interviewed on the day he received the honors of having being able, the honors he received for the Louvre in Paris. And he had a quote about humility. He said, "Humility does not mean that I make the slightest compromise. To compromise is to surrender. After all these years, I dare say, both myself and my buildings are like bamboo. Even within the biggest storm, it just involves a little bit of a bending." Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. Our final speaker, Liu Lifan, is a PhD candidate of School of Architecture, University at Pennsylvania. Liu's dissertation examines the use of Chinese landscape painting as a conceptual device in contemporary architectural practice. Liu was trained in architecture in both China and the States. She also practiced as an architect and a researcher after receiving his master degree in architecture at the State University of New York. Her research interests include historical and theoretical connections between painting, architecture, and landscape architecture, and the possibility of an interdisciplinary transaction within practice. Let's welcome Liu.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about two of Ian Pei's more well-known projects in China, Fragrant Hill Hotel and Suzhou Museum, but through a slightly different perspective. It's a pictorial vision, thank you, of space. When Ian Pei looks back over 60 years of his career, he felt a sense of continuity in his practice, part of which is retaining the tie to the cultural root of his childhood home in China. The architect acknowledged a profound influence of the experience in his family garden in Suzhou and the great importance in shaping his design concept. This connection between Asian garden and Pei's modern architecture can be discerned in many aspects, from material application, spatial organization, to conceptual accordance. Together, they form a unique expression in Pei's projects in China, alluding to a particularity compared to the celebrated modern language of the architect. The distinct look of Pei's projects in China are built upon many factors, and the most evident one is the persistent use of key elements in the designs. Rocks, as the unique component in traditional Chinese gardens, are continuously employed in Pei's project in China. Rocks were endowed with great aesthetic and cultural significance in traditional China by tracing the reiterations of consistent formal characteristics in rock art from the 2nd to the 17th century: leanness, shou, surface texture, zhou, and perforated structure, toe, Zhang He suggested a consistent look of a wonderful rock, and more importantly, a demonstration of accordance between human creativity and the models provided by nature, a philosophical principle deeply rooted in ancient China. Suddenly, this grand concept was immersed in many different art forms in China, as He further examined this interpretation in Chinese landscape painting. Chinese garden, on the other hand, is no less a compelling demonstration, particularly in the creation of rockery landscape. This continuous practice from the 11th century onwards cannot be considered as an immutable one, but nonetheless, the aesthetic criteria had formulated into iconic expression exemplified in the type of Great Lake rock. The existing gardens in Jiangnan area demonstrate this particular look in various scales, in which rocks can be treated as independent sculpture or form a large-scale composition, such as Pei's family garden, Lion Grove Garden in Suzhou. Pei's fascination with rock was fostered in this family garden, and it has grown into a profound influence on his own development. Years later, when recalling this feature, not only did the architects vividly describe the process of harvesting the rocks and their compositions in the garden, Pei also recognized their great metaphysical importance. Quote, all of it has instilled a lasting metaphysical image, if not a direct influence, on the shape of my work. End quote. So when Pei returned to China in 1979 for his homecoming project, Fragrant Hill Hotel, rockery landscape was a key feature in the design. The wonderful rock was presented throughout the entire design process, from general planning to specific landscape feature. The grand scheme of the design was to continue Chinese building tradition in modern construction. Following this statement, Pei's team composed a collage situating the building complex into a 17th century hand-scroll painting by Zheng Chong. Looking closely at the collage, the landscape background is not simply a cut-out section of Zheng's painting. Beyond choosing the most dramatic section of the hand-scroll, there is a meticulous effort of duplicating those cliffs and regrouping them to encircle the modern building. Here I highlighted several evident duplications. A series of modifications of the landscape took place following duplicate the cliffs, including similar actions with vegetations and transforming the water shore. In sum, there was a process of building the landscape rather than simply recognize it in the design. Calvin Chow, the producer of this collage, recalled a painstaking process of cutting and recomposing the landscape, which in Pei's mind would better represent the topography of Fragrant Hill. However, compared to the gentle slope of the actual site, the dramatized cliffs visualize a much stronger connection to the wonderful rocks in his childhood garden. The modified landscape continued to articulate the same aesthetics and associate principle shared among rock art, painting, and gardening in China. In this sense, the collage does not simply function as the metaphorical integration between tradition and modern by inserting a drawing of modern building into a traditional landscape painting. But building a dramatic landscape, it articulates a specific look that Pei was aiming for in his design, that is, the same formal tension between landscape and architecture that Pei observed in his family garden. When it came to the rockery landscape in the gardens of hotel, searching for a specific look was even more evident. Pei did not choose the typical Great Lake rocks, nor the Yellowstone from the local quarry, simply because they did not have the right look. Instead, despite not being suitable for an area of frequent sandstorms, the limestone from Yunnan province became the final choice. In the design, the limestone was used both in the outdoor garden as a grouped landscape feature, as well as the indoor atrium as an independent sculpture, following the typical constructions in Chinese gardens. Interestingly, there is a visual alliance between the limestone and depicted cliff in the collage, particularly in the pronounced vertical surface texture. In a sense, the limestone in the garden brings this dramatic pictorial landscape into reality. The change in rock type, however, did not weaken the formal tension established in the collage. In general, the goal of this modern construction still anchors on the established aesthetic criteria of wonderful rocks and its cultural significations through a specific look. However, this look seems to disappear in the rockery landscape of Suzhou Museum. In this construction, besides recognizing Ji Cheng's famous claim, the whitewashed wall as paper and the rocks as painting upon it, Pei used a hand-scroll painting of Miyoren as the primary reference of the design. In construction, the granite from Shandong province was sliced into thin pieces and then shipped onto the site. They were arranged in parallel in 3 tiers of platforms. The platforms were raised consecutively in elevation to simulate a vertical planar organization of representing depth in Chinese landscape painting. The stone was carefully treated to configure a simple triangular shape, which were iconic of Mi's painting. Furthermore, a blowtorch was used to retexturize the peaks of mountains to imitate the famous Mi dot, a brushstroke invented by the painter's family. Hence, framed by the boundaries of pedestrian walkway and the black tile eave, the rockery landscape is dematerialized from the wonderful rocks and become a painted land scroll viewed from the central hall of the building. In Suzhou Museum, Pei detached the design from the classic aesthetics as well as the iconic image of a good rock. In an interview, the architects acknowledged the change of the rockery landscape was to intentionally distance the feature from its particular narrative in Chinese tradition while still maintaining a sense of connection to the past. Pei's preference of this design, of this painting, particularly, relates to his interpretation of literati painting style in creation, which does not focus on the formal imitation of natural landscape, but to realize the accordance through an interaction between human creation and the models in nature. We may compare the 2 pictorial references to further contextualize Pei's explanation here. So Zheng Chong was a professional painter who emphasized on the technical excellency and visual intricacy. The school was attentive to technical details and conventions in representing the landscape. On the other hand, Miyoren was listed as an exemplified painter of Southern School, also as known as literati painting. Southern School favored individual expression over technical precision, articulating an active interaction between human and nature in creation. Certainly, this historical development of Chinese painting was much more complicated than the stylistic summary here. But nonetheless, this broad claim is instructive when considered the appropriation in other arts. Although Pei's choices of the 2 paintings were largely intuitive, the shift in the pictorial model certainly alludes to a modification in Pei's design approach. So to use the painting reference as analogy, the emphasis on the visual resemblance and specific formal quality in Fragrant Hill Hotel is transformed into a literati approach of subjective interaction in Suzhou Museum in the design of rockery landscape. This major shift can be considered as the architect's careful refinement of his interpretation of cultural continuity, from formal and symbolic assimilation of tradition to a creative interaction that accords with the philosophical principle in traditional thinking. So this shift, recognized in the design of the rockery landscape, can be projected onto the architectural solutions of the 2 projects. In his interview in the design of Fragrant Hill Hotel shortly after its completion, Pei also explained that the idea of continuity through material application. The architects specify a vernacular tile along with the white stucco wall as the main cladding materials to express the continued beauty tradition, particularly in the practice of South China. The chosen material visualized a black and white look of building, resembling a typical image of traditional dwelling. However, the application of the gray tile was critically challenged in most reviews of the project, interpreted as the formal manipulation of postmodernism. Even Pei admitted a decorative motif of the gray tile beyond its function of concealing the control joints. The criticism has a reasonable assumption, for the uneven layout of the pattern on the facade does not correspond with the technical concern of distributing control joints. Another evidence is a different treatment of exposing control joints on the facade of corridors. For Pei, the gray tile, along with the white stucco wall in Fragrant Hill Hotel, puts emphasis on the formal and symbolic resemblance of the tradition. Therefore, the gray tiles, arguably excessively decorative, perform in the same way as the rocks in the garden to deliver a continuity through a specific look. Pei's certainly aware of the danger of this decorative use of material as a type of stylistic manipulation of historical reference. So he directly responded to the criticism of postmodernism when he returned to Suzhou Museum with a modification in material application. The building is finished with two major materials, white stucco wall and black granite. Yet, in this project, although the granite performed the same protective function as the gray tiles of Fragrant Hill Hotel, the material demonstrates a much clearer construction logic in mind. The black granite is the material for all types of edge trims of the building, including trim stones of all openings, edge trims at the corner of the surface, and trim division at the transition of the floor level and walls of different heights. Without decorative patterning, the design expresses a clear construction logic of concealing joints. The building remains the same black and white look. This appearance, while still an anticipated image of the design, is visualized through a very different means. Essentially, Pei's revision is a self-criticism of the symbolic expression of the black edge at Fragrant Hill Hotel, following his interpretation of the rockery landscape in Suzhou Museum. The material application anchors on the construction logic developed in the building tradition, a profound principle that sustained the building practice. In this discussion of continuity, we may also remind ourselves of other significant transformations that further contextualize Pei's two projects. When designing Fragrant Hill Hotel in 1979, as argued convincingly in Cole Raskin's presentation at Harvard, it was a moment of forward-looking in China after decades of traumatic cultural and political upheavals. Carrying the political agenda, modern expression with demonstration of advanced building technology was the mainstream of hotel design at the time. In this sense, Pei's retrospective design of Fragrant Hill Hotel and his articulation of the connection to the past was quite distinct, or even radical. We may further consider this visual and formal emphasis in his project as Pei's critical response to the contemporary practice and his own personal belief in the modernization of China. However, the socio-political context of Suzhou Museum in 2002 was quite different, in which expressing cultural identity was a prevalent topic facing the globalized practice in architecture. Yet Pei's pursuit of continuity still anchors on the unchanged life that he observed in Suzhou and its resonance to the past. While we can easily imagine a complete different and acclaimed reception of the model of Fragrant Hill Hotel in contemporary China, as I have stressed in my presentation, Pei kept refining the concept in the design of Suzhou Museum, representing a clear vision and precision in his own personal language. In other words, in Pei's interpretation of continuity, their persistence as well as alternation. They're not simply political or circumstantial reactions. Rather, they belong to a coherent architectural ideal that the architect pursues throughout his own career. With this summary in mind, let's further consider the unique spatial organization in Pei's projects in China. In the analysis of Fragment Hill Hotel, Joe Didio and Strong identified a different configuration in the design. Quote, unlike most of Pei's buildings' freestanding sculpture forms, Fragment Hill is more painterly, since indoors and outdoors unfold together, a garden in the park, as in the Chinese scroll. This identified pictorial quality implies a spatial complexity as well as a different experience in space. The pictorial notion reflects directly to the collage of the project, in which the building compound was drawn in axonometric view. As Calvin Chow recalled, it was not perspective, because this is the Chinese way of seeing. In the Chinese scroll, the mode of seeing is certainly a very complicated issue. In an overly simplified summary, Chinese painting, while in sections largely remain a direct visual experience, follows a logic of glance without a focus point in an overview. Therefore, there are essentially two ways of seeing Chinese pictorial vision: a stationary view of a fragment nature, as well as a wandering glance of an expansive landscape. This pictorial vision was directly translated in the garden art in China. Indeed, in the Fragment Hill Hotel, the design aimed to further translate the pictorial visions in modern construction. Enclosing 11 spacious courtyards, Pei carefully oriented the guest rooms for a designated view of the gardens. As he explained, quote, windows are not just rectangular openings whose purpose is to let light in. They are like picture frames in the wall to define exterior views, and then the garden is always there, unquote. Furthermore, the design includes many elaborated frames with designated views to imitate a faithful construction of Chinese garden, articulating this pictorial vision of space. Therefore, although the painterly organization of space of Fragment Hill Hotel is a direct result of saving the old trees on the site, this initial step was only the beginning of an integral scheme of creating a pictorial experience in spatial thinking. In the design of Suzhou Museum, while the framed stationary view are still pronounced and even more carefully composed because of the urban site, Pei aimed to draw all the partial views through an experience he referred as meandering across the central pond. Along with the zigzag pedestrian passage, we find an open and immense vision, with a bamboo grove at the west, a tea pavilion at the southwest corner, a terrace facing south towards the main hall, and the rockery landscape against the north wall. The meander, beyond structured by the path, anticipating a wandering experience visualized in the Chinese painting. Again, we observe a continuous application of painterly organization of a space with a refined vision in this work. Pictorial vision anchors on the visual experience, and Pei actually carries the same vocabulary when he discusses space. Following the painterly space, the architect talks about Chinese garden as an experience of surprises, and the organization of the space is to motivate people to look and explore. This interpretation of space, while can be culturally specific, certainly shapes a general spatial perception of the architect, as we can trace similar concepts or concerns at different stages in his career. And now, we also learned from Professor Wu Guangting today that it seems to be the case in the Chinese pavilion in the 1970s he designed. So this topic is too rich to expand in this presentation, but certainly parallel to my analysis of the pictorial vision in Pei's design. In conclusion, in Pei's designs, you may still argue that the connection between the past and the present, between tradition and modern through this pictorial medium is peculiarly Chinese. On the cultural level, maybe it's a valid statement. But there is also a sense of continuity in Pei's personal vision in architecture that cannot simply be bound by a specific cultural narrative. Through this particular picture, we begin to discern an intersecting point in the construction of Pei's architectural ideal. Therefore, beyond the categorical claim of Chinese spirit, in this picture, we may begin to see how a cultural artifact functions as a living force that informs the architectural practice today. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to invite 4 speakers to the front, and we have about 1 hour to discuss. Yeah. Yeah? No. 40 minutes. Sorry. Okay, thanks for all the excellent presentations. There are a lot of fascinating details and analysis as well as argument. But somehow I was depressed by reading you guys' articles last night after the good dinner, because under this such a narrowly defined topic, visions of China, you guys construct the argument with this point of view so divergent from each other. It takes huge struggle to come up with coherent points. And let me try to recap and to sort of exaggerate each one's argument to the extreme degree. I think let's see, talking about being Chinese or the Chineseness of the design, and Chang Qingwei, you seem to argue that through the Tonghai University campus, everything Pei did had nothing to do with Chineseness, because all the obvious Chinese elements are done by Chen Qikuan and Zhang Zhaokang. And everything Pei did should be referred back to groupuscules, modernism, or even more accurately, high modernism. But that kind of a category already embraces everything, based on which we can understand Pei's design. Then Wu Guangting goes to the opposite view. Everything Pei does has Chinese elements, right? So not only Osaka Pavilion, China Pavilion, but Everson Hall, even East Wing was National Gallery. It was implying this implication of the internal atrium as a courtyard, the kind of a typological transformation, but into the Western typology, but as originally Chinese elements. Okay, then Juan did this really fascinating case study trying to explore the complexity of Pei's design process and also Pei's personality, sometimes outspoken, occasionally outspoken, but mostly diplomatic, resilient. And there's a great character with complexity, inner complexity, and outside complex performance. And but on the other hand, Liu Lifan depicts a kind of a trajectory with high degree of consistency, the pictorial view. Right? So now, in order to really put this together, to crack the question open, I like to start with a really brutally dumb question. Let's focus, focus on the topic, the visions of China, and really zoom in onto one single element, the Suzhou Garden, because Liu Lifan, you sort of treated Chinese garden as interchangeable with the Suzhou Garden, right? So first, I would argue probably Suzhou Garden should not theoretically represent all Chinese garden, right? But let's put this aside. Let's see, the really dumb question: why Pei has such a fascination with Suzhou Garden and sort of to use that element everywhere in Beijing, Hong Kong, and not only Suzhou, everywhere related to Chinese. Why he treats Suzhou Garden as kind of a representative cultural icon for Chinese architecture, right? Of course, we all know that his personal biographical connotation, but you're not allowed to mention that. Let's go further. Yeah. Should we start? Yeah, one by one. And a second rule is that the speaker is not allowed to repeat what the previous speaker has said, right? So then we should have 4 different explanations.
Well, so first of all, definitely Suzhou. Thank you. Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I would also want to acknowledge that Suzhou gardens are definitely not Chinese gardens. So is, the paintings that I displayed or examined in the very short analysis is not it's not Chinese painting. There are much diversity and much complexity in that. But for Pei, I think why he is fascinated with garden, with a Chinese vision. When I say vision, I mean literally Chinese way of looking. Is very intuitive because of his childhood experience in the garden. And garden actually has a very, Chinese garden, spatially speaking, is very complex, but it has a distinctive spatial quality that is beyond its formal or its formal resemblance of landscape, right? So I think he continuously, as I was trying to discuss a little bit more towards the end, is he continuously in his entire career and talk about space as a sequence to motivate people to look, to explore. And this type of concept definitely come from Chinese garden and that intuitive experience. And I feel like as much as we wanted to establish this statement of Pei's architecture is about form, is about geometry, is about technology, there is a rich part and maybe under-theorized part in his architectural career is he really cares about experience, and he talks about it a lot, and it's a very specific experience that he inherited from Chinese garden. And I think I would like to make this argument, and I hope I started this argument in this talk today.
Make it very clear. So, garden implies a sort of a sequential spatial experience. That's one of the essential quality for using garden onto the design.
Thank you, Professor Zhu, and for your brilliant questions.
It's not brilliant, dumb question.
It's indeed. It's indeed. Okay, so I mean, making sense of Chinese architecture experience, first of all, is nothing if not a daunting task. I mean, because all the efforts doing that goes to explain how an objective and comprehensive history doesn't exist. So here I mean thinking, IMP as an under-theorized figure at the symposium as our main concern here today. I think we should have to think IMP. I mean beyond the question of Chineseness, not only how he about the issue about the East meets West and vice versa, but also how he, I mean, apply the various approach to design. Not only like in my own thesis, I have a chapter for what I call bricolage modernity, which is how all of these forms, no matter from Rome, Greece, or from the Bauhaus and so forth, but how they serve as a toolkit of forms for Chinese architects, especially those, I mean, went to the overseas training, like Liang Shicheng and so forth before Pei, and how they just freely choose the forms in the context of the project they are commissioned accordingly. So today, I think I try somehow to do the presentation up to the methodological level, which is regarding a double agency, as I mentioned, the partnership and the authorship concern. Because in Bauhaus, the training, today all our concern about Pei is somehow trains our side to his relation to the Bauhaus. But the point I would like to make here is that when the group is, after his sojourn in the UK, when he moved to US, the Bauhaus has been somehow transformed. And not unlike Liang Shicheng, when he was at the conference at Princeton in 40s, he has been somehow modernized, if you will. He's no more the Baudin architect anymore, especially if you see his program back at Tsinghua University. He tried to establish a college including accommodating different departments beyond architecture. So, I mean, and this is, but Bauhaus is focused on teamwork. Somehow, the individual name is trying to be under, but this is another story if you can't get to the Chinese context, because it's not until the first generation of Chinese architect back to China in 30s, then Chinese has architect, the so-called architects, something that still radicalized by, if you trace back to Renaissance, how they distinguish builders from architects.
This is all clear, but why don't you go back to the question, the dumb question, why garden so important to Pei?
Maybe he thinks it's not important.
Is it? No, you're forced to answer that.
Could you say again?
Why the garden or garden element so important, so essential in Pei's design, especially
from his
Chinese project?
From his project, yeah, back to the graduate and to his practice, sure. And I mean, because the garden is certainly, because actually we have to, I think I think we have agreement that Pei actually, because his learning and growing experience, he has not, there's no way for him to be involved so much as Zhang Zhaokang or Chen Qikhuan to the China context. That's for sure, because that's according to his own journey to the US. His trajectory is totally different from this Chinese architect we just go through. So I think that somehow when he have the very beginning opportunity to go back to China, to go back to the vision of China, let's say, vision of China. Because in Taiwan, that's actually the project that he has a chance to serve the Chinese context, even before the Fragrant Hill Hotel in 70s. So what he can do is try to, as I say, from the toolkit of forms he has, to try to pull out the elements, the ingredient he can do. So somehow he, after Huadong project, it's relatively, it's not an unbuilt project. So it is somehow not really well finished. But when it goes to the Donghai University in Taiwan, that is something need to be put in practice. So somehow Pei shifted his role as a curator, as a coordinator of this Donghai 3, even including Wang Dahong, a would-be architect at the Donghai as well. But how he organized this team to work for Chinese needs on his own version, from his toolkit, and to drop the elements he thinks is workable, not only garden, but also how, because his understanding of Chinese needs is limited, so he do as much as he could. Not only garden, he tried to put the artificial lake in Huadong, but this is not an option back in Taichung. So he tried to do something else, like the pitch roof or the platform-based college, as I mentioned. Actually, he went to Japan before he decided Donghai University. And UBCC applied the
They were
visa
not
for him.
allowed to go back to China to visit the vernacular and the garden. So are you saying for early Pei, either out of his own deep memory or cultural imagination, he took garden plus the other elements as a quick token to conduct his design relate to Chineseness? Early Pei.
I mean, in my presentation, I try to let archive speak. So this is not, but if you ask my personal opinion regarding this, I would say, because this is something out of Pei's well understanding. So the best that he can do is, like what he learned when his childhood back in Suzhou, the sizzling, the garden is about the lake, the trees, the shrubs, and how the experience, not unlike the Lai Deling, who presented at Harvard, the first part of our symposium at Harvard. He talks about the past tense of architecture of Pei. That's how he embedded time into his space. The way he can do is try to such, even though a little bit formalistic way, but that's how he tried and how he organized as a plus of these real people have more understanding of Chinese needs to help him to put it into the context.
Thanks. Wu Guangting.
Yes, in my case, I think that when we're talking about the Chinese needs things, when the government of the Taiwanese did not decide to not adopt the pedestal as a Osaka Pavilion, and I think we need another paradigm for the for interpreted the Chinese needs. I think the Chinese garden, especially Suzhou Garden, is more importantly to me it comes from the Donghai University. The Donghai University to me is a kind of a landscape project. It's not only the architecture design project, but also the more important is a landscape project for us. So if we wanted to talking about the modernity things, I think that from the Donghai, I think the landscape of the campus is more importantly than the building itself. So this is the reason one. Second reason is well, even I think that I agree. I'm sorry about that. I agree. Li Fan says about his childhood place of the experience of the Suzhou Garden. In my study of the Everson Museum and the East Wing, also the Chinese Pavilion, we can say we can see the plan. Each of the case they have a kind of exhibition space. Dark is a dark space, and the bridge is a light space, and the light and dark. That's kind of a Chinese painting, say, or it's a 柳暗花明又一村. Yeah, I can say it in English, but 柳暗花明又一村 is kind of 意境. It's a kind of 意境. I can say in English. Sorry about that. 意境. How to say 意境?
Sometimes just translate atmosphere or disposition.
Yes. Yes. So even those cases is different scale, but I can read it by from the plan. It comes from the Everson Museum, and I read from the complete works. The IMPE says the Everson Museum comes from the Korea House. So that to me is I can relate to the those Chinese living things. So it's especially the Suzhou Garden to me is more important than even from my study of the Donghai University or study of the Everson East Wing, also the Osaka Pavilion. Yeah.
Great. So basically, to summarize, two points. One is the notion of landscape imposed on the equivalent important level as building as object, they all together. So that's meaningful, the significance of a garden for Pei, starting from Donghai University. And second, to concur with Lin Fan, the undulating, the changing sequence experience of bright, dark, and the suppression and elongation, all this changing spatial experience, even within a self-enclosed building, that somehow transmit Pei's experience for Suzhou Garden, even into his Western projects. Jane.
Okay, thanks. First, I would like to clarify something, but maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I find it a little bit puzzling. We're talking about Pei's childhood home being Suzhou Garden. Ian Pei was born in Guangzhou. When he was 1 year old, he was smuggled out of the country by his father and arrived in Hong Kong 100 years ago. So we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Ian Pei, but also the 100th anniversary of the Bank of China in Hong Kong. Ian Pei spent the first 10 years of his life here in Hong Kong. He's never been to Suzhou. until much later. He moved back to Shanghai after his father was giving a official pardon from the new Republic government, said we will not prosecute you, please come back. So Ian Pei went to junior high and high school 10 to 17 in Shanghai. He visited Suzhou and certainly some of the Suzhou gardens, especially the Lion's Grove, which for a period of time used to belong to his family, but he didn't grow up there. So, and then he went to the US, 17 years old, trained as an architect in the US in all of the traditions the first presentation has outlined. And the first time he ever was allowed to go back to China was in 1974. He was one of the first Americans holding an American passport to be allowed to go back, and he organized a group of people to go back. So that means during the majority of his architectural training and adulthood, he never saw Suzhou Gardens. But the point I want to make is I'm not trying to say it's not important to him. I very much believe that the Suzhou Gardens is a source of constant cultural connection of a country that he still, I hope I had proved my point, very passionate about, but couldn't see until he was 56 again. So that, I think, is a very personal reason why the Suzhou Gardens is important to him. I don't think, I know Tao, you were saying we're not allowed to mention the fact that the Lion's Grove Garden used to be his family childhood home. I'm mentioning it because I don't think that's true. Because if you look at the way Suzhou Garden, or the ideas and concepts of Suzhou Garden that is used in Pei's work throughout his life, we can't find anything that's specific to the Lion's Grove other than the rockery. Meaning, what I mean is that he was inspired not only by the Lion's Grove, but also by a lot of the other gardens. Netmaster, I think the Artist Garden, Yipu, etc. So that's my first point of it's a personal reason why it's so important to Ian Pei. The second reason I think is an architectural one, and I would answer Tao's question was why the Suzhou Garden is so important to Ian Pei was why not. The Suzhou Garden is China's southern scholarly garden. It's immensely experiential, it's spatial, it's artistic, it's literary, it's informal, it's improvisational. It has evolved for centuries. And I believe that that Ian Pei saw in it a lot of affinities actually with modern design. That it wasn't something dogmatic. It's not like the palatial design or the pagoda design or kind of the courtyard house. It allowed him an imagination, architecturally speaking, to be able to experiment, to try different things, to play around. I mean, the Suzhou Gardens very much was the individual owners and artists and painters, and to kind of take a corner and do something with it. So I think that the Suzhou Garden as a source of inspiration for an architect like Ian Pei should not be surprising and should be expected.
Last night over dinner, Sandy, is Sandy here? Still here? Sandy was asked whether you consider yourself Cantonese, Suzhou, or some kind of identity else. And Sandy puzzled and said hybrid. Okay? Out of Ian Pei or Pei's family's extraordinary complex experience, I think Jen, you answered Pei is very determined to pick up Suzhou Garden as paradigm. Probably out of all the gardens they experience, all the paintings they experience, they determine to choose or to take the given selected paradigm. Suzhou Garden is the best, has the most refined quality out of a Chinese garden, or representative. Or as literati painting is considered the highest level of cultural production versus what you call professional painting, right? That's kind of a given cultural judgment. They take that as given. So then the following, I think the afternoons, before we open to the audience, afternoons topic is about formal and spatial skill of composition, etc. It's more. So I wish we could still have the opportunity to discuss further. For example, when you deal with garden as design or an organizational principle space, I guess Pei is deemed to struggle on the massing, like how to create this otherwise freestanding big mass, to break down and to dress the mass with the lines, with the timber frame, like lines. That could be another interesting question for us to discuss further. With this kind of an intersection or interaction. Then I think, do you want to say something, or we open to the audience? Nifan? Yeah, let's open to the audience for a question.
Thanks the panel for a very stimulating presentation and discussion. I would like to say that I'm from Singapore. My name is Judd Hui, so I think my question maybe come from my own subjectivity as an overseas Chinese. I think there's some tension between the name of the panel and the content of the presentation. The name of the panel say Visions of China, but the content of the presentation deals with Chineseness or cultural identity. So China, the notion of China itself is a political entity, and political entity is different from Chineseness as a cultural identity. Of course, China is the largest territorial state of cultural identity. So my question is that, are there some problems with conflating the state, China itself, with the notion of culture, Chineseness? I wonder whether if this is a China-centric view of Chinese culture or China-centric view of Chineseness. So if this is a China-centric view of Chinese culture, can there be a non-China-centric view of Chineseness? And if there is one, what would that be? So I think there's a long history of overseas Chinese, and their kind of a belonging to China is a tense and diverse and a complex one. And also their construction of Chineseness, I imagine, because of their difficult relationship or distant relationship, I'll say, with China, their notion of Chineseness would also be very different. I personally, as an overseas Chinese, I see PEI as part of that category. So to rephrase maybe Tao's opening question, rather than 何谓中国, maybe the question is 何谓中华文化? And if we put culture as the center of the discussion, then I would argue that 中华文化 or Chinese culture itself is necessarily diverse and plural because of this long history of having Chinese in overseas territory. Thank you.
Would you like to respond? Why visions of China or versions of China automatically goes to the cultural identity of China?
So I remember when Pei was designing the Miho Museum in Japan, actually this political issue came up. And then in the interview, I don't remember the specific question, but it's definitely regarding the political difference or the tension between China and Japan. And Pei said, politics is different, but people's life is another story. He believes cultural continuity, as I think I emphasized in my presentation, is beyond this political boundary or political vision. And I feel Pei himself certainly concerns more on the idea of cultural continuity or the shared cultural value or signification a lot more than viewing himself as a politically bounded Chinese, so-called that. And then I also think why he go back to one more point of the Chinese garden as the prototype or paradigm in his design. I really don't think it's the garden itself, architecturally speaking, as this formal quality of garden. Maybe I've mispresented or misemphasized in my presentation, but I also think Pei, in so many cases in his designs, he will refer to dwelling. He will talk about the common people's life. He will say, well, if in Italy you design something, you don't see Michelangelo's painting, but you go to Italian village and watch how people live there. And he referred to Suzhou as a type of life that he experienced in his childhood. Again, an experience that he relied on in his design, which is much more complicated than this kind of formal or spatial quality that emphasized in Suzhou garden. So go back to the political boundary. I really don't think, okay, because I'm Chinese, I live in mainland, I live in Hong Kong, I live in Taiwan, or even Japan, then we should have a different vision of how we live. Maybe Pei was idealistic in this way of thinking that the cultural root bound people more and share a lot more common things. So people actually live more happy in that way. And that's how he represent or interpret it in his architecture.
I would like to maybe on behalf of the Cole and tell to clarify something. The panel names came after the papers came in, so it's not that we all answered to a topic of visions of China. So just so you understand, first of all, just so you understand that
Your
point.
valid question, because we're talking about Pei in relation to China.
So, but I was going to say that, but that does not mean it's not a valid question, but there is something in the way you phrase that question as if we're all answering to this call of visions of China with these things. But so that's why I find the question very interesting, but a little bit perplexing, because I think each of us presented a very different versions, as Tao was saying, about China. And I think in my presentation, I did try to make this distinction between Pei's attitude was working with the government, that it wasn't that he was saying that he will work, he was saying that he would work with this current state or this current government in the hope of improving the lives and the conditions for the entire country. I also think that we should make a distinction between state and country, meaning just because the government of a certain country is a certain way, that does not apply to everyone in that country. So, you know, I.M. Pei himself and his father and his parents, 15 generations, have worked for different dynasties in China, from Qing dynasty to late Ming dynasty, Qing dynasty, early republic, later nationalist republic government in China, the communist government post-1949, and in the future, right? So I think that we should also not view China today as the China it has always been or always will be.
Okay, yeah, I mean, thank you so much for the fabulous question regarding the problematic topic of our session. But I mean, but I say, when you talk about politics as a vision of China, vis-a-vis you say culture regarding the Chineseness. However, I think, I mean, what is modern, what is China, what is modern China, or what is culture, what is politics, depends on in which context, whichever context the question is triggered. I mean, at least, I mean, architecturally speaking, when it comes to Pei, I think there's no very outstanding distinction between the two, because obviously we see on the one hand, political side you must put into your consideration, because we obviously see how much the Chinese background of I.M. Pei, no matter what his citizenship is. But I mean, he's from China, his background representative of Chineseness serve a very good resources for him to obtain many projects, including Donghai and the Fragrant Hotel and Bank of China and so forth. So I mean, politics is certainly something you have to put into your consideration, not only when it comes to Pei, about as long as you talk about architecture, how you get a project, how you persuade your client, your background matters. And as for culture on the other side, I mean, it serves as more much like an identity for I.M. Pei, I think, which enable him would like to sometimes, I mean, in certain specific circumstances, he step back to serve as a director of a film or a curator of an exhibition, not unlike what we saw at Donghai. And So yeah, I mean, the question is really important, but how is it really necessary to distinguish politics from culture and vice versa when it comes to the topic as of vision of China? I think it depends on which context the question is promoted, and that matters a lot. Thank you.
Okay, before Wu Guangting answer, I need to clarify the questions in order for Wu Guangting to answer further. Okay, now it seems we can all agree for Pei himself, three levels. Ideologically, he believes in sort of cultural transcends politics, right? And in terms of personal development, culture offers self-identity in whatever context, right? On the practical level, politics is a means. Cultural products is a purpose. Through whatever games he plays, in the end produce culturally meaningful products. That's the ultimate goal for architect, right? We sort of agree with on that. But to remind you guys that the conference is not about his own belief, right? And it's about how the scholars tackles Pei, right? So I would really bounce the question back to Wu Guangting. As a scholar, how would you position yourself to study Pei rather than how to actually reaffirm what Pei believes in? Yeah.
Well, I think that the Pei is a smart architect, and yes, he's smart.
That's all clear. But what about you as a scholar?
Yeah, as a scholar,
How to study Pei? Right? It's so profound and so articulate, so refined. How to actually really study such a figure?
Not only through the lens of Chineseness or not.
yeah, I answer the question. In my understanding, all the things come from in that time. All the things come from the political power. So when you say the China 中国跟中国文化, I think it's equivalent to, because of the political reason. It's you cannot say the Chinese culture except the political decision. So I think the very in my study case today, when we decide adopt the not adopt the Pei style to the Osaka Pavilion, we need a new paradigm. What I say just before, and Pei led the team to reconstruct the national state, and I think he's that's why I think he's smart. Yeah.
I have one comment and one question. The comment is about the panel. I think we're trying too hard to split Mr. Pei into two halves. There is a Pei who's very much interested in Chinese culture, but there's also a Pei who's a lover of, I'm just thinking, Henry Moore, Du Buffet, and it goes on, and Wu Ki-Chou. I think we ought to combine the two sides of Pei and then come up to the idea of a vision. Otherwise, it's just Pei fighting Pei himself always. Well, it's easy for me to say, but anyway. Another question is for Dr. Chiang, who made a really informative presentation of Tonghai University and so on. However, I'm very curious about your conclusion. Why would you say Tonghai campus is to be modern, if not just modern? And what is your idea behind it? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Zhang, for your insightful question. With the detail in my conclusion, which is mentioning about the to be modern project, what I call a to be modern project. Because this has to go back to see how a project like a Donghai was commissioned to the TSC in the beginning when he was still the Huadong University in Shanghai, and how the project was turned down and shipped to Taiwan. Because the original idea of the project was the UBCCC would like to establish an institution of Excel. Because all the missionary school, universities they established in China has been forced to shut down due to the Mao Zedong in order to establish his communist nation. So they tried to shift the program to Taiwan. But the something that they realized is that the palatial style they used to use based on the American architect Henry Murphy, who was, because when the project, the reason why the project is able to shift to Taiwan has many things to do about the American ad, the Cold War context, sort of what we call the Pax Americana context. Because all the context we see them is people try to accept the assistance, including the discourse of the intellectual field, including architecture, planning, landscape, and so forth from America. Because where has been a very established school teaching architecture. But when they move to the context of Taiwan, there's still something they try to pursue is the modern, no matter how much they understand the modern and how they define the modern. It's all about the endeavor to be modern. And that's the reason why they want an architect like Pei. No matter how much about China he understands. But the point is we need somebody like I am Pei who studied with Griffiths from Bauhaus and graduate first at MIT, later at Harvard, to design such a campus to make the specific distinguish from the palatial style designed by architect like Henry Murphy or so forth on the mainland. They try to make the clear distinguish for the post-war UBCCC, United Board of Christian College in China. So that's all the message to be modern, but how you decide the modern is depending on the specific, again, the political context the question was triggered. And not least, it goes back to the cultural details regarding Chineseness. When you really put into your program, your design, your idea into the practice, and how all of it is specialized in urban landscape, like Donghai. Yeah. Thank you.
Set in to depict the process, with a strong will and the intention to becoming modern. Yes. I guess that's the term. Yeah. Okay, Wei-Jin, you.
No, my question to the panelists is, how much do you think Chineseness is really an agenda for Pei throughout his career? I actually have slightly, I believe Pei is a good architect, modernist. He only, throughout his career, only when he was invited by clients of Chinese government, whether it's Taiwan or People's Republic of China, which is up to 1980s. He's already a very well-established architect. Then he respond from Fragrant Hotel to Suzhou Museum and Miho. That's kind of a similar mode of transform his triangular geometry and structure system into. So is it more of a response by the client, or is it really an agenda that he explore or his architecture all the way through? Like Wu Guangting was mentioning, even in the East Wing, you think that is Chinese garden or there.
But not only for Chinese clients. Sometimes when the Louvre pyramids, he was under accusation. He sort of defend himself that I'm not from the country of Disneyland. I'm from China, with the cultural backgrounds occasionally. But I'm sure you have deeper answers to Wei-Jin's question.
Well, I think So I very much agree with Professor Zhang Yonghe's comments that you cannot simply split Pei into two people. One is a Chinese architect or architect practice in China, or one is a Western or modernist architect. But I also very much agree with Professor Wu here when he talks about a similar spatial quality throughout his entire career. And I don't think it's the only sources he refers to is Chinese garden or a Chinese identity. But I do believe he likes those space, and he keep doing that in that way. It's similar to, it's a personal preference of in architecture practice. That's why I argue, I say, there is a continuity, a sense of continuity in Pei's own practice, that he keep developing an architectural ideal that he prefers. That's his personal. That personal vision cannot be divided as his practice in China and his practice in the U.S. or in the Europe. But then when he comes to China or East Asia, when he refers to his client, I'm Chinese, or I use Suzhou Garden as prototype, maybe there is a level of negotiating, or how a project was conveyed to a client because of a similar background, a cultural, a shared cultural opinion. So that's in that way that my project can be more accepted in this context, right? But I think if we move beyond that, there are like when he designed Eastern Wind in the National Gallery, then he also referred the experience of surprises of exploring as a way of Chinese garden. He reminds himself constantly going back, but it's not that, again, it's not really just Chinese garden. It's that kind of spatial quality that he really likes. That's how I think about it.
We're sort of running out of time. We need to open to the audience for more questions, maybe 2 to 3 questions. Janet.
Thank you. This is, excuse me, is this working? Yes. Okay. This is in some ways just a confirmation of a lot of observations that were made. But think of, I am going to MIT and being confronted with Beaux-Arts architecture. And it is the symmetry of it. And it was the symmetry of it that he rallied against. And his preference is asymmetry in dynamic balance. And that's kind of critical. And it goes back to this whole idea of spatial and experiential architecture. And I remember one kind of incredible conversation with him. We were talking about Grand Central and the whole idea that they wanted to knock it down, right? And that was ultimately proven to be a very unpopular position. But I am, even after that, looked and said, it's not a very good space. And I was kind of surprised by it. He said, that's exactly it. You look at it, you see it, and you understand it immediately. There's no surprise there. There's no discovery. And so I think all of a very important part of his architecture is experiential, is spatial discovery, is the same kind of delight in a garden. The shifting of views, the shifting of directions, the expansion of space by virtue of those shifts. And in terms of, yes, absolutely, in Everson, but for the National Gallery, there was a renderer. His name was Steve Oles, and he was giddy with the whole experience of being invited in to help visualize and to make sure that everyone talking about triangles was in fact envisioning the same thing. And so they would talk and he would sketch, and then they would all look and say, yes, this is what we agree that we see. He was so thrilled with this experience, he brought in a tape recorder and he hid it in the plant. And so there is a record of this dynamic of design process going on. And it's very clear IM is talking about getting from this space, and then what do you see? What do you experience? And then you shift, and that is the way to go through his buildings. So I think that's kind of critically important. And in many ways, it's just reaffirmation of what you're saying.
Definitely, we're going to have more layers of understandings in the afternoon session, the formal special practices. Let's open the question to the other corner. Sylvia and the one behind Sylvia. Yeah, two last questions, and then we go for lunch.
Thank you for the presentation. I think all four speakers has touched upon about Mr. Pei's efforts to build Chinese cultural identities through modern building. But when I look at the programs of the 4 projects discussed today, they are university campus, museum, pavilion, and bank tower. So what I'm thinking is, where's housing? Is it a reason why that housing is really not important, or is it not an agenda for Mr. Pei in trying to put the Chinese identity into the modern table?
Will someone respond? Pei did design a lot of housing.
A quick response, yes. IM Pei and the offices of Pei Free Co-ops and later Pei Partnership has done housing in the U.S. and all over the world. So it happens to be that the panels today are speaking of these non-housing projects. But to maybe a way to address is that IM Pei himself have often said that he said that an architect can't always choose the project and client. That's the nature of architectural practice. But he very much preferred to work on civic buildings that can be open to the public, because he very much believed that that's what he really enjoy, and that's what he would like to be able to apply his architectural knowledge and his sensibilities. Which is perhaps part of the reason why so many of the writings on Pei is looking at the civic buildings. I want to just take this opportunity to say that, again, to emphasize, while this panel has the title of Visions of China, I don't think any of us are saying that IM Pei's work should only be defined through his Chineseness or not. I want to give an anecdote, is that IM Pei has said he named a building that he saw as a teenager, and that it was this building that inspired him to be an architect. And the building is still standing on the Bund in Shanghai today, and it's the Peace Hotel, designed by Hungarian Czech, right? Park Hotel, designed by Hungarian Czech architects. So I to go back to what Yang Ho has said, is I think that so much of discussion on Pei, not just today, but I think a lot of architectural criticism on Pei, have focused too much on trying to say, is his work Chinese or not? Where is the Chineseness? To talk about the work in relationship to cultural issues and spatial issues and knowledge related to broader China is very useful, but to constantly be arguing should that label be applied or not is really not useful. And I didn't present this quote in my lecture, but I highlighted one in the paper that I found deeply problematic, and that somehow has been echoed a little bit today. The London-based Architectural Review does these columns called reputations, and it's usually talking about architects near the end of their career. Kind of this short piece that summarizes the architect's work. So in 2012 was when Architectural Review decided to do a reputations on IM Pei. And this think piece summarized Pei, I quote, and I quote this because it is very frustrating to me, but it's also something that I echo today. Pei's work is corporate in character, leavened by loss-leading cultural complexes, and only rarely and almost guiltily Chinese. The 2011 Pritzker went to Wang Shu, whose work is tactile, hand-shaped, at times surreally idiosyncratic, as if that's what Chineseness is, but also linked to Chinese traditions in ways the roots-seeking Pei never understood. Pei's Pritzker can only be read as a pointed rejoinder to Pei's cohort of global corporate firms. So I really think this is a very good example and vivid example of really looking at Chineseness somehow being something you can define in a picture or in a few words. This is very deeply problematic, especially we're looking at someone, Ian Pei, and his work. He has said over and over again he's not a Chinese architect, he's an American architect, and he draws his inspirations from whichever site he's working in. So I emphasize this idea of site and purpose. I could have presented his Miho Museum today, and I probably wouldn't say anything about China in that presentation. So, you know, while this panel is very much talking about these issues, I would like to kind of point out that it is multi-layered and complex, and it is something that really changes through both Pei's work and our discussion of it.
Okay.
One shouldn't also be apologetic about Chineseness, because otherwise, if we then how could we read Edward Said's Orientalism? So you know, I think that it's not about Chineseness as a way of being Chinese. It's about ingrained, important cultural differences that allow the richness to happen around the world. So I think that one cannot look at Chineseness as something that, you know, I don't want to be called Chinese. So I think that it's good that you didn't quote that, but you actually did quote that ridiculous quote anyway. So you should have probably not quoted it, actually.
Sorry, I have to cut off. We are completely running out of time. We did spend 1 hour for discussion. So anyway, it's a good start. We cannot apologetically talk about the topic we choose, right? But then the PM session definitely would give us a much fuller understanding of Pei's spatial and formal aesthetics. Okay, thank you guys. So see you in the afternoon.